Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this forum, which is part of the Roadshow series that we're calling 10 Pathways to Death and Disaster, featuring Emeritus Professor Michael Quinlan. My name is Martin Ralph, and on behalf of my colleague Peter Nissen, we are your hosts today, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this forum. This is we're in Perth, so it must be number 6 in the series, I think, so far. And we're taking the roadshow around the state. We've been to Kalgoorlie, Karratha, Bunbury so far. We've had 2 industry sessions, the second one this afternoon, off to Geraldton next week before Michael heads back to sunny Launceston in the middle of next week. It is great to see a full room, and we're just delighted that Professor Quinlan's work is starting to generate so much interest. As I said earlier on, we will be interacting with you via Slido. So for those of you who didn't shoot the QR code earlier on, the QR code will pop up a little bit later on. We'll prompt you to log back in as we sort of get to those critical points. So if I can just sort of lay some of the administrative ground rules today. First of all, big room, and in the event of an emergency, we'll be in the care of the Pan Pacific caring staff, but they're our 2 principal exits, and the doors we came in through will actually be grabbed by Pan Pacific staff and basically escorted out of the building, where we actually then muster down on the esplanade. Today's session's being videoed. We've had such demand for attendance in public that we've been booked out in basically every one of the forums. So to help those who couldn't make it and were on the wait list, we're videoing today, and we're going to be putting that up as a package on our website just as soon as we've done all the editing. But also you see that our communications team are here in force. They'll be wandering around taking photographs today. That'll make it into our social media feeds, no doubt. But if you don't want your photograph taken, please let our photographers know, and we will avoid shooting you if we can. We have had plenty of requests for copies of our presentation. So what will happen is, once we've finished in Geraldton next week, there'll be a few days of sort of, collecting our thoughts and catching our breath, and then we'll actually be packing up the slideshow. We will be then making that available for download off our web, and we will be advising you via our weekly safety alert, the email that goes out, when that package will be available. So can I just ask, who is getting those weekly alerts now? Excellent to see. For those of you who aren't, at the close of today, we'll give you the link on how to subscribe to that weekly alert. It's proving to be a very, very useful communication aid and giving the industry insights into what's coming over the horizon with not only mine safety, but also the broader WorkSafe organisation. We've already spoken about Slido, and just the location of the toilets is out of the door, past the reception area where you've all got your badges. You keep going past them, and then on your right hand side in the second part of the floor here. Okay, so I won't linger over this next slide, which is the QR code. So we've already done that, and just to introduce, first of all, is on behalf of the department, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders past and present. Now, let's introduce our little team who's going to be here today. So as I said, my name is Martin Ralph. I'm a Regional Inspector of Mines. I'm part of the leadership team at Mine Safety. My colleague, Peter Nissen, is Team Leader in the North Region. But more importantly, Peter is a WHS specialist, and he is our go-to person in terms of mine safety management systems. But the star of the show is Emeritus Professor Michael Quinlan. He has recently retired from the University of New South Wales. He tells us that he is busier than ever, and he will actually tell you some of the activities he's engaged in now. But really importantly, the whole of today's proceedings are prefaced by Michael's watershed publication, 10 Pathways to Death and Disaster. This is now coming up for 10 years since it was published. We did some work on this in 2016, But it wasn't until I actually rejoined the department in 2017 that we really started to promote it and to try and take lessons from the experiences that Michael has had that he captures in this book. Not my job to promote the book, but we actually do have a link at the back of the presentation to where you can get a copy from, should you be inspired enough to want to purchase one. A little bit about the sessions today. It's a bit loose, this agenda. This is sort of, as it comes. The one thing we will do, however, is we're locked into a break around 10:30 about morning tea. There's a couple of opportunities for questions and answers, and that's where we will actually be reading from your Slido input and putting the questions to the panel. And you can see we sort of share things around. We are programmed to finish at about 1 o'clock, but has been the want so far. People have wanted to come up and have a quick chat with Professor Quinlan after the event. We will stay for a little while, but we've got a 2 o'clock session this afternoon. So if you do want to grab him, get in really early, okay? Because I will be pulling him away from the auditorium. Okay, having got out what we're about today and what we're going to cover, I just want to ask, who here attended the roadshow in 2017, 18 or 19? Just a show of hands. Get them up high so I can see. It's not many of you, hey? And that's been pretty much the response that we've got from the other forums as well. So a little recap then, for those of you who did, but maybe new data for those of you who weren't in one of those roadshows. We've obviously had to stop the roadshow series of events because of COVID and other events have taken over. So this really is the kick up again from 2019. At the 2019 roadshow, we shared this graph with the delegates. Essentially, it traces the history of our fatality performance in number of fatalities since the time we started recording fatalities in the late 1890s. And it's pretty evident to see that, there was very, very poor performance in the early days of the industry in the state, and it has increased or improved significantly since then. The stunning data is in that time we've had 1,942 fatalities, and those fatalities are only current up until the 2016. I will refresh that data a little bit later on in the afternoon. We highlighted then that 110-year average is 16.2 mine workers who did not make it home at the end of their shift. But you can also see that number is heavily biased by the pre-war years. So then what we did was we had a look at the 17 years between 2000 and 2016, and there were 66 fatalities in that period. And over that time, well, hang on, sorry. Go back. And then over that 16 years, the average was 4.1 fatalities per year. And at that time, we were suggesting to the industry, that's not good enough. And pretty much the conclusion out of the roadshow was that everyone agreed that we can do better, particularly if we aspire to be a global leading industry sector. And we are in many fronts. But in here, we're just a little bit behind, I think, where we could be, even though those numbers may be somewhat more flattering than the previous experience. So to bring you up to speed, and before I just move into the next slide, two things happened out of that 2017, 18 and 19 roadshow. The first one was we collected data from all of the delegates on their sentiments in terms of how their particular operation was performing against Quinlan's 10 pathways. And we're going to reproduce that questionnaire via Slido later on in today's session because we want to see, has anything changed in the last 4 years? The other thing that happened too was we then passed that data across to Edith Cowan University. It then was used by a PhD student whose name is Tanya Jenke. Tanya crunched those numbers and made some conclusions, and then she also compared those numbers to what's called our fatalities register. And I'll come back to that a bit later on. And Tanya then drew some conclusions, and from those conclusions we can actually put a state of play in terms of where we're at with the contemporary industry. Now, Tanya's paper was published in 2022, and I commend it to all of you in this room. It really does give a snapshot of where the industry thinks they're at in terms of their fatal risk control initiatives. But she actually said in 2020, that was the last available data that Tanya had, there was about 140,000 workers in the industry. We know there's about 160,000 now. And we actually had, that was representing about 10% of the state's workforce. In the period between 2000 and 2020, we had 77 mining fatalities. Of all of the fatalities that are experienced in workplaces in the state, that 77 represented 15%. 15% of fatalities, 10% of the workforce. The conclusion that can be drawn from that is that the mining sector is overrepresented in terms of our fatal accident performance. And where are those fatal accidents occurring? Now, this is just a very brief snapshot of data up until the middle of this year. And I will put a caveat on this. The caveat is that this does not include accidents that have led to a fatality that are still in the hands of the coroner, or where there's a question as to whether it was workplace related or natural causes. So it's as up to date as we can get, but with those conditions attached. You can see where the fatalities have occurred. In the north region, 27, in the east, 20, in the west, 5, and in the south, 2. And I say again, the data is a bit fresh, and it does need a little bit more of a polish. And those stark numbers are really in your face, right? And you go, wow, what's happening up in the north? But when you then compare the person hours that have been worked across each of those regions, you get a somewhat different picture. And so when you look at the fatality incidence rate in fatalities per million hours worked, you can see that in the east, which only had 20 fatalities, much less hours worked than in the north, the east actually predominates. And so it depends upon the metric that you're using. In gross numbers, there's a lot happening in the north, but in frequency rate terms, it's the east that we need to focus our attention upon. And of course, this data shapes the Mine Safety Inspectorate's strategy for the next 2 or 3 years, as will your feedback from these forums. So we want to get you started and using Slido at this point in time. Okay, so if you could take out your mobile device, and what we'd like to ask you is, you can have a bit of a chat with the people next door to you, but if you're on the same operation, that will work. But if not, using Slido, can you please tell us what you think is the greatest hazard on your mine site that is likely to result in a fatality? And can I just put out to you, complacency is not a hazard. Okay, so let's eradicate that from our conversation. All right, so try and think in terms of what is the hazard that poses the greatest fatal risk to your workforce. And this is only opinions here. And as you enter the words into Word, you'll actually see the word cloud start to form, and you can watch it come up. We're getting some great feedback already, thank you. And again, if I can just remind that, believe it or not, this feedback actually helps us in terms of setting our strategy as well. So we've got 60 of you giving me feedback so far, thank you. Up to 64. We'll get up to about 75 and then we'll sort of, and you're welcome to keep putting it in, but I'll move on after 75. Fabulous. And you can all see off your devices that vehicles are predominant, right? Vehicle interaction, vehicle to vehicle, heavy vehicles are in there as well. Vehicle and mobile plant ops, bang. And that's we're getting up for 83 of you have given feedback. So thank you very much for that. And so you're welcome to we'll keep that live for a couple of moments. So 2 things out of that. Number 1 is I've got you using Slido, and number 2, you've given us some feedback on hazards. Now then, having got you started on that, it's only fair then that I actually give you the analysis of what our fatal accidents have told us. This again from the previous roadshow, 2000 to 2018. Now, if you are leaving here today and you're hoping to take some data back for a toolbox meeting, this is a really good slide to shoot. Feel free to actually take a photo of it. And in this data, we are very, very confident about, say, it's what we broadcast previously. So, when we think about the fact that you're saying that vehicles are a major or the major hazard, when we look at the data from line 4 downwards, vehicle collision, vehicle over the edge, vehicle runaway, vehicle rollover, that's 17 fatalities there that involve vehicles. So you're right on the money. It's just that we can actually cut it in a little bit of a different way by using our analytical tools. But fall from height is also predominant. And whereas, if vehicles, we're doing things with vehicles, we can't forget the fact that this is our next highest area of concern. And so any of the strategies we're deploying at our workplace don't just get swept away by vehicles. That fall from height is actually a significant contributor. I also don't want to lose sight of maintenance procedure deficiency, mainly because it links straight back into Michael's work. Okay. So some of the data then in terms of what Tanya Jenke did of her research. So we collected all this information from the road shows, and we visited 11 different towns and cities, 2 different mine sites, so 13 operations across that time. We actually got over 2,000 responses, which has got a lot of statistical power. It means that the data we're about to share with you has some significance about it. And this is what we found from those 2009 participants. And that is, over the 10 pathways, the mean score in 2000, well, in fact, it didn't vary very much at all, did it, between 2017 and 2019? It's around between 6 and 7, which is, I'm going to put that as a meh score, right? It means that we're doing okay, but there's room for a lot of improvement. And significantly, there were 2 pathways that stood out as being the flaws across the industry. So if we, collapse all of those 2,000 responses in 2017-18, consistently failures in auditing were predominant, and then in 2019, failures in design, engineering, technical, and maintenance was the key theme. That's what I mean by that failure, or the 8 fatalities that have happened due to poor maintenance procedures. Why it's so important to us. There was another startling revelation that came out. And it's startling because, wow, it was just so self-evident. But it actually backs up a lot of other research that's been done in general safety and health. And that is, on every occasion, at every forum, participants in the road shows who identified as safety and health representatives always scored lower across the 10 pathways than those people who identified as superintendents or managers. So, it's the people at the pointy end have got a distinctly different view of the risks that they face from the hazards in the workplace than those who may well be driving the system. Now, I'm sure, again, if safety professionals in the room, you've probably heard that ad nauseum, but I hope that's not too news for folks. It's why worker engagement and participation is just so important in our fatal risk control efforts. And Jenke and her co-authors then basically said that on the back of the feedback and the analysis of the fatalities register, we recommend that organisations familiarise themselves with Quinlan's 10 pathways and use their employees' perception of their effectiveness in the pathways to inform their safety improvement plans. And guess what? That's what today is all about. I'm going to invite Michael up to the stage, and as he's making his way, we will be giving you a survey opportunity as well that you can take back to your workplaces to actually gain your own perceptions of your own workforce. So ladies and gentlemen, fresh from Bunbury last night, but Launceston 2 weeks ago, can you join me in welcoming Professor Michael Quinlan to the stage?
Thank you. It's good to be in WA. I'm a bit short-sighted, so I'll have to peer at the screen occasionally. Forgive me for that. Emeritus is just a fancy Latin word for has-been. Let's put fatalities in broader context. 2020 figures, 4,746 American workers died. Thank you. Oh, that's... that was a rate of 3.4 per 100,000 full-time employee equivalents. Australia, 190, the following year, which was the latest figures I could get, 194 fatalities, 1.5 fatalities per 100,000 full-time equivalent employees. So we're doing a lot better than the US, and my US colleagues looked at this figure and went, yeek. That's a technical term. And so we have brought the fatality rate down. Australia is not at the top, probably the Scandinavian, Sweden, probably, if you're looking for a country that's probably even better. UK looks better, but they fudged their figures. They don't include transport fatalities, which is one of the fatal sectors. I only discovered that about 12 months ago because they don't broadcast it. So their figures look better than ours, but not really. If you look at the overall incidence of fatalities at work in advanced industrial countries, of which we are one of them, one of the old advanced industrial countries, they show very much the same pattern that Martin showed you for Western Australia. That a lot of fatalities in the late 19th century, early and the first half of the 20th century, then falling away. A significant reduction in a number of mass fatality events. So we're getting very good at stopping mass fatality events. Not perfect, but we're getting very good at it. And also a slide in single fatalities, which is the great majority of fatalities. Even more so today, but even in the past, more people died in single fatality events in the early 20th century than died in mass fatality events. However, over the last 10 to 20 years, it has started to stagnate. It's not clear we're getting improvements. I was at a Queensland safety rep training week they have for their safety reps in the mining industry in Rockhampton, week before last. Time flies when you're having fun. And Mark Parcell presented and pointed out that for the first time since 1921, Queensland was probably starting to go backwards in the mining sector. The other thing we need to remember here is that even if things look static, that may be disguising something, because two areas that have significantly improved in mining, but more generally, but particularly in mining, is our rescue technologies are much better and our medical treatment is much better. So some people who would have died in 20, 30 years ago are not dying today because of better rescue and better healthcare and medical treatment. So if we look at a static figure and you're saying, yeah, but we may not, this static figure may be, we're not doing as well as we could. Now, let's hope I haven't had the technology. Yep. Now, and this is a long-term figure. Four sectors account for over 70% of all work-related fatalities. Those are construction, road transport, farming, fishing and forestry, and mining. Now, do you want the good news? And the good news is that you are much safer in a mine than you are driving a truck or going onto a construction site. That's the improvements we've made. Australia is emblematic in its mining industry of demonstrating that we can run a highly profitable, efficient mining industry, which is also safe, relatively safe. And we're almost at the point, of chipping out of that horrible 4, so that it would be a horrible 3. Now, we're not there yet, and I think we've got considerable scope for improvement, and we, as Martin suggested, can become the emblematic mining industry in the world to explain to people how to run workplaces safer, and we can become the emblematic industry for other industries in terms of them wanting to improve their health and safety performance, other high hazard industries particularly. This figure does not include work-related suicide, which is strongly occupationally related, and that the suicide rates in a number of occupations are well above the average. I've given you some of the areas there we have a body that deals with that in WA, Mates in Mining. Now, I'm going to declare an interest, even though I don't live in New South Wales anymore, don't want to live in New South Wales anymore, even worse. I am a New South Wales Director of Mates in Construction, and that's one job I really am very passionate about, because the World Health Organisation has designated the Mates model as absolute world's best practice as an intervention to deal with suicide. The other area we don't deal with in those figures is work-related disease. Now, I quote the 4 to 6. That's out of date. It's worse now. More people die because we have reduced the fatality figures, but disease we've made less progress. So, and I know there'll be quite a bit of interest on dust diseases in the mining industry. There'll be the union in Queensland's running a global union conference in February, where they're inviting out 2 or 3 of the US leading experts on dust disease to give talks. So there's more activity to happen in that space. And by the way, the pathways model applies to health and disease. It's not just an injury model. It's really a model of why organisations fail and why they fail. So this is a bit about my background. I first got interested in mine safety in the mid-1980s. I was living in Queensland at the time, in Brisbane. I had a lot of contact with Ipswich, went down the first mine at that time. Started to wonder whether the reason miners were dying might be recurrent, and began to look at disasters. Over the years, I've spoken to a lot of managers, engineers, safety reps, union officials, and like any expert, you go in, you talk to people, and it's a two-way process. You come away knowing a lot more. I know more since I've done these road shows than I did at the beginning. And if that hadn't been the case, I should be hanging up my shingle and retiring. When you stop learning, give it up. In 2004, I was appointed as one of 3 experts onto the New South Wales Mine Safety Review, chaired by ex-Premier Neville Wran. He did an excellent job because he let the experts write the report. And we all agreed. So that was great. Beaconsfield in 2006, I was part of the independent investigation, not into the rescue, but into the fatality, Larry 9. There were 3 of us. There were 2 experts. Scott Marisset, a geotechnical engineer from WA, Canadian-born. I worked very closely with him. And I was the sort of management systems, mine, general safety person. There was another, Ed. He was a lawyer. So, but I worked very closely with Scott on that one. In Pike River, I was in New Zealand talking to a safety conference that Tim Bentley had invited me to from ECU, and Pike River blew up. I was engaged by the Department of Labor to write 3 expert reports because they knew they were in trouble and they needed some credibility and some independent expert reports. So I wrote 3. One was to evaluate a report on mine safety and its implementation that was done in 2009, and like flaws in auditing, they'd only implemented some of the findings of that inquiry prior to Pike River. 2, to evaluate the best health and safety mine legislation in the world, looking particularly at 5 countries. There were 3 jurisdictions that came out on top: Queensland, New South Wales, WA. New South Wales and Queensland became the models for the new New Zealand legislation, which is pretty good, state of the art. And the 3rd one I was asked to was evaluate mine safety performance. So taking my earlier experience, I thought I can play with the statistics, and people do that, and you might learn some things. But what if I delve down deep into a series of fatal incidents to see if I can identify if there are current causes there, if there are causes that keep cropping up and that we can intervene and do something about. And that's been my approach. And that was really the genesis of 10 Pathways, because I looked at all the mine disasters I could find in 5 countries between 1992 and 2010. And I also looked at prior research, Andrew Hopkins, and as I said, other things from that. Okay, and Andrew had been playing with that idea, but he hadn't really taken it up. So let's put failure also into context. When you have a fatality incident in a mine, or a multiple fatality incident, the mine shuts down. Now, I have read a lot of mine company annual reports, riveting reading. I used to teach organisational risk, so I looked at them, and in terms of the financial risk, they're wonderful. All the data on how they're trying to mitigate financial risk. But when you come to the safety section of that report, what do you get? Lost time injury frequency rates, medical routine injuries, maybe reports of 1 or 2 serious events, and a series of parenthood statements about how important it is. But the mine might also say that the company, that they're boosting production at one of those mines by 20% in the next year. There's nothing on how they're going to do that safely. So, in my view, the risk analysis is completely skewed, because if you have a serious fatality event, your mine shuts down. And the 3 I mentioned there, Pike River never reopened, and that's not unusual. Beaconsfield was shut for at least 8 months. Now, you know better than anybody else in this room how much it costs for a mine to shut down for a day, let alone 8 months. And then Grosvenor was also shut down for a considerable period, and that wasn't a fatality, but it was about as close to a mass fatality incident as you ever got. Do you know the Grosvenor incident? It was a methane explosion at the Grosvenor coal mine in central Queensland, Moranbah, in May 2020. So it's not a long time ago. And I'm going to come back to that one, because there's a really interesting thing about how healthcare, say, averted a major fatality event. But of course, in addition to that, we have significant human costs. Now, I'm a prevention guy, as I guess most of you in this room are. But as part of that, I would talk to widows. It's a draining experience. Over the years, and I felt they're giving me really wonderful information and I'm giving them nothing back, except an ear. I decided at the end, and with a couple of colleagues at Sydney University, we decided to do something about it. We got a small seed fund from the construction union to do a preliminary study, interview with 7 families, and then we got a major ARC grant, Australian Research Council. That's one of the 2 big premier federal government research granting agencies in Australia, to do a major study of this. It's the first study of the impact of traumatic death of workers on families in the world. It gets cited now across all other literatures because they don't have studies, even military deaths, police deaths. They cite this study because they don't have anything like this one. Because we went to the coronial records, we interviewed all the stakeholders, the unions, the employers, the regulators, both types of regulators, workers' comp, prevention, lawyers, all the bodies that played into it. And then we looked at what the legislation did, and then we also interviewed the families. We did a survey, a global survey, US, UK, Australia, Canada. I think we tried New Zealand as well. And again, the first of its, and then we did follow-up interviews with some of those people we surveyed. So it was a very rigorous methodology. And what did we find? The results were surprisingly uniform across all the countries. And what we found is that 61% of those people, mainly women, because 90% of workers who die are male, although I'll be talking about some women who died at work in the mining industry today. 61% had post-traumatic stress disorder, 44% had experienced major depressive disorder, and 42% had experienced prolonged grief disorder. There is no closure. People that use terms like closure, it's very clear. People learn to deal with this. And the other thing is it's not just the immediate family members. You see the 16 to 20 people there. Every workplace fatality on average affects 16 to 20 people. That is not the family members, workmates, close friends. And of course it affects the workplace itself. And one of the things that I was with a workplace tragedy support group, I was patron, they used to get the widows or family members to go into, in mostly construction industry, and talk to workplaces about the impact of a workplace death. So a significant number struggle economically after that. 24% of the families were struggling financially before the death, and that jumped to 62% after the death. 74% applied for workers' comp, not all got it. And this was a depressing one for me because I thought we had a better workers' comp system than the US, but the results were pretty similar. And I know we actually had made some improvements for workplace death in the workers' comp regimes in Australia in the last decade because we picked that up. Other impacts, the families, self-help groups and services provided, other sorts of support. Now these, if you have a workplace fatality, and I really hope you never do, these are the 4 things you need to know from the perspective of the family. And this is our survey results, but it's come out repeatedly. This is equivalent to the mining, relevant to the mining industry because they were part of the survey, but also outside the mining. When I saw the Dreamworld interview, they were interviewing me about the underlying causes, but they spent 12 minutes talking to one of the family survivors. Lovely bloke. But I could have told Lee Sales what he was going to say. Because I dealt with these issues and he said exactly that. Again, I'll come back to the rescue and the human interest story narrative that goes on too much in health and safety, as is more generally. They want clear and timely information on how and why the death occurred and to what extent the person who died suffered. They want the person not to be dehumanised by the legal process. They want their name used, not the deceased. There are memorial walls in mining and construction for people that have been killed, either individually in groups. And as in war memorials, people want to see their names. They don't want, this was the deceased, number 777. Third, they want identification of any responsibility for the causes of that death, and if there was a legal breach, they want a prosecution with a significant penalty. That will act as a deterrent. It's not about revenge, it's about deterrence. They want a penalty that will actually persuade whoever is responsible to take steps so that won't happen. Which comes on to the 4th and final point. What they really want, and they almost always say this, they want remedial measures taken so no family ever has to experience the hurt and suffering they've had, and that they can say they've lost this person that was really dear to them, but some good did come out of it in the sense that interventions were introduced that will make sure that that sort of event doesn't happen again, or at least make that very, very unlikely. So why do we look at failure patterns? Well, I used to teach organisational risk, not just health and safety, but broader organisational risk, corruption, financial risk, to master's students. And because I've been involved in these inquiries, of course, that helps with your... Failure can be as instructive, if not more instructive than success when we're looking at serious, low frequency, high impact events, which both multiple fatalities and single fatalities fall into. The usual KPIs, lost time injury frequency rates, medical treated injuries, are of no value. The only thing I learned in Beaconsfield when I went through the workers' comp data on the impacts of fall of ground is there are a small amount of incidents, but there's almost no, if you could call it, minor injury resulting from a fall of ground. That was all. We need different stats. We need to look and drill down into our HPIs, which is why I'm so depressed when I never see that in annual reports of mining companies. But how then do you understand risk? Well, the first thing is, if you're teaching risk, you're trying to understand risk, is if you cannot identify patterns, you cannot manage risk. If you cannot identify the likelihood, the magnitude, but also other qualitative aspects of the risk experience, you will never be able to manage risk. So managing risk is about identifying patterns. And the best evidence we have, it's historical evidence, is the past. HPIs, fatalities, that's how you learn. If you draw the lessons from them, if you're careful, you look at them very rigorously, and you do recognise that things change. Though in terms of miners' deaths, there are 8 ways miners die, and there's only one new one in the last 100 years, and that's electrical. All the other ones go back well over 100 years. And I would also I'm going to make a general point here, what I also did when I was teaching students, of management students, for my sins. I would say to them, you can't do generic risk assessment. If you don't understand the hazards, you will never be able to manage the risk. Now, we have a very good understanding of hazards in mining, and that's the first step. So while my model will apply to, as I'll point out, to other industries, one, it came out of mining. It wasn't inserted back into mining. So it was based about an understanding of mining hazards. Two, if you're going to use it in other industries like oil rigs and that, you need to understand the hazards before you do the risk assessment. And anyone selling you a generic risk assessment package is probably selling you, and I won't use the technical word, but it begins with crock. So I decided, now Barry Turner wrote a wonderful book in 1978 called Man-Made Disasters, and it was about examining a series of disasters, not just workplace ones, to see if there were patterns. It's a path-breaking book. So I used essentially Barry Turner's method. I decided I would look at all the mass mine fatalities in those 4 or 5 countries between 1992 and 2010, and I would also look at a selection of single fatalities. I missed 2. One in WA, an inundation event in 2000, and I also missed North Parks, which I'll talk about later, which was an air blast in 1999. I'm sorry. So I ended up with 24 fatal events. 15 involved 3 or more deaths, what we might commonly call a disaster, and 9 single fatality events, just to see if they were the same patterns for single fatality events. And I identified, all my experience leading up to this point, I'd started to think about what might be the pattern causes. And then as I read through all these incidents relating to that, they started to basically jump out. There was only one that I'd never thought of, because I'm a prevention guy, until I actually, and then I honed them down and I talked to people. I talked to a leading aviation expert who'd done a lot on fatigue, Anne Williamson. She was a professor of aviation safety, and I said, I've got auditing as a separate category, you could include it in systems. And she said, no, keep it out. So that was great. I got some reinforcement from people I spoke to. I also, as part of the book, it's largely about mining, but there is one chapter that deals with other hazard industries, because I thought, are these lessons from mining applicable in other industries? Are the same 10 pattern failures occurring in other industries? So I looked at chemical plants, refineries, oil rigs, aviation, shipping and road transport, and the short answer was yes. The same pattern failures were there. But as of that big caveat, need to understand the hazards before you'd start looking for the risks and the pattern failures. So the 10 pathways I identified, at least 3 were there in virtually every incident. The vast majority had 5 or more. And some, Pike River had all 10. How not to manage a coal mine. Grosvenor, which was a high potential incident, had 8. So, in other words, these causal pathways apply to mass fatality events and single fatalities. And this has been confirmed by subsequent research, which I'll get onto. The other point I make here is investigations vary in their quality and depth. Mass fatality events, where you get a Royal Commission, Board of Inquiry or something, used to be very forensic, and they look at many issues. Your run-of-the-mill, and it shouldn't be run-of-the-mill, single fatality event doesn't get the same level of attention. But as Andrew Hopkins made the point when he reviewed this book, the more detailed the investigation, the more pathways you found. So there were probably other pathways in those other events, but serious questions on them weren't asked. Who's heard of James Reason and his Swiss cheese model? Yep. Okay, well, you'll hear from Peter and I today that we are fans, but with some caveats. Okay, so, and I'm going to take some of Peter's thunder. Reason developed a notion that we in mining we're great at it, but humans are wonderful. They develop these complicated systems to deal with what are otherwise inherently dangerous activities. Putting a 200-ton object into the air and landing it safely on a regular basis. Going underground or in a large open cut mine and going home safely every day. So what he had the notion is we've got these multiple layers of defence so that no single failure can cause the event. Don't worry, Peter, I'm not going to cheat. I'm not going to cheat and steal your cheesy one. But as Reason pointed out, these are latent failures. Now, big point, and this is one that Peter and I are in total agreement, and it's Peter's point. They're not hidden. They're there because when you go back and look, they're staring you in the face. So they're latent, but they're not hidden. And these are holes in your defence. The Swiss cheese has got holes in it. And if you get an alignment of the holes, but I'd argue pathways are not quite lines, they can twist around and find a hole, you're going to get a serious event. So even if you've got multiple layers of defence, because they've got holes, that means the system is, or the workplace is still vulnerable, the mine is still vulnerable. And they can remain undetected for a long time. They can sit there for years. They should be detected, but they sit there. And what can happen in the end is what appears a quite idiosyncratic action triggers them. Or one simple action triggers the alignment and you get a result that you didn't want. It's almost impossible, although a lot of focus is on the individual behaviour that might have been the last trigger, that will almost never work, although it's a common stopping point. And I'm going to give you some examples of that, where there was an action that wasn't entirely safe, but it should never have come to that. It should never have got to that point. If the proper systems had been in place, it would never have reached anywhere near where it ended up. And you can't stop it at that level. There will always be some sort of idiosyncratic combination of events or actions that will lead to. What you've got to do is stop it at your latent failure stages, up further back. Because those, and what Reason didn't actually write about, and was my point, and what Teamwork Pathways is about, is are there a significant number of repeat holes? Are there failures that repeatedly occur that pierce all our defences? And the 10 Pathways says, yes, there are, and here they are. So that's a picture. That is actually the Upper Big Branch mine, which blew up also the same year as Pike River, killed exactly the same number of miners. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about metalliferous mines, and those are your 10 failure points. But I'm going to go through them now and explain them. The first one is flaws, engineering, design and maintenance. Poor decision making, management. One of the really interesting feedback we got from the Bunbury session from one of the safety reps was if you've got poorly designed or poorly maintained equipment, that is not only precipitative of an event, it's extremely stressful for the operators to be using it. So if you're looking for a psychosocial hazard, you've got poor maintenance, you've got a psychosocial hazard, as well as the precipitator to a serious thing. Now, you know, I'm not a fluffy sort of guy. I like hard thing and I like engineers, and I think we can design really good and robust systems, and this is a higher order control. So this is your first stopping point. If we can engineer the hazard out, and I think we can in many, many instances, it's the one we should go to. Now, how often was this failure associated with a fatal event? In my PhD student, Heather, she did a study of 51 serious events in New South Wales mines. What proportion do you think she identified design, engineering and maintenance failure? Any feedback? 50%? You're getting close. 94%. So that is your biggest single hit in a fatal event beyond all others. And what do we do when we do that? We introduce more administrative and behavioural controls. Now, Peter will have some interesting thoughts on that, but I'm going to tell you for the obvious point is, if you've got an engineering, design and maintenance problem, behaviour isn't your solution. Now, the second one is prior warning signals. I've been looking at fatal incidents for 4 decades now. I could probably name the number of ones where there were no clear warning signals on the fingers of one hand. This is not unique. European Environmental Agency looked at environmental disasters, came to the same conclusion. Do we get clear warning signals? These are not the lawyers saying hearsay or retrospective intelligence. You know, yes, we know a lot of things after the event, and now we think we actually knew things before. No. These are things that any informed mine manager, supervisor, HSR, regulator would say, this is, and I'm going to give you examples of them, things are not right. This is something that really requires attention. prior to the event, sometimes years prior to the event. And people expressing concerns, and that's important in terms of some of the thing today. You need to listen to the feedback you get, and I'll give you some examples. The third one is failures in risk assessment. They didn't undertake it. They didn't do it properly. They didn't have the right team. They didn't look at all the underlying hazards. They didn't look at all the existing controls. They did it, and then they said, that's a nice bit of paper, and didn't do anything about it. They failed to monitor. Not much point doing risk assessment without monitoring it after, and implementing a remedial actions if that your monitoring tells you that the risk assessment, there's a problem still with your controls or your new methods. I'm going to give you some examples. Fourth one is a failure in management systems. Now, our new legislation is all about systems. So you're going to get the word from the inspectorate about how important this is, and you already know. Systems are critical, but systems need to work. You do not want the Monty Python Holy Grail situation, you know, when they all gallop up on their phony horses and they shout, Camelot, 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 and then someone says, it's only a model. Elaborate systems can be only a model. I've gone into other workplaces in this city where I saw a health and safety expert with a wonderful looking model, except there were forklift trucks driving all around the site, colliding with, at speed, almost tilting. And I thought, mate, if you're not dealing with that, forget about the system, you know, because your system should be saying to the manager of the site who's spending good money on you, this is your problem, or this is one of your big problems. So, and it's the same. So again, there's the second message there. You need to walk around the site. You need to familiarise your site. You will see things that you probably don't expect to see, don't want to see, but need to see. And I'll give you some examples of that. Number 5, we use auditing in safety in two senses. There's the proper meaning and the generic meaning. The proper meaning is auditing as an independent, external, episodic, periodic review. And then we also use it in relation to our internal processes, our monitoring. Now, I used to get up and say, that's not auditing. But I don't care. They're both important. And monitoring should be continuous. They're both important. And you've got to do them. And if you don't do them, no system is worth it. And again, the best system in the world is worthless if it's not implemented. And in some ways, you're better off having, I'm not advocating this, you're better off with a system that isn't perfect, but is rigorously implemented. That is a better situation than having the best system in the world that isn't implemented. Ideally, you've got a good system and it's rigorously implemented and audited. And auditing is one of the ways you find out how good your system is. And another bit of feedback we've already had in these sessions, and I've done this, when you're auditing or something, you're trying to confirm the system is working. Okay, so you look at the paperwork, and then at a selective number of work processes, you actually go out and check out if they match what the system said should be happening. And you ask people to explain how they're doing a job safely. You do a challenge audit like that. We probably need to learn from cybersecurity. We need to find out how robust our systems is. How easily is this system circumvented? How easily is it for this to break down? We need to ask that question. Can we break this system down quickly? If it can be done very easily, that's a message. If it takes a lot of effort, that's another message. Okay, so we're coming on to number 6. This is the Voldemort pathway. This is the one that we dare not speak its name. But we have to. Because if executives are paid bonuses, if managers are paid bonuses, production bonuses, if workers are paid production bonuses, and I'm going to give you some examples, that is going to affect decision making. If a mine is cost cutting, needs to reduce costs, if it needs to boost production by a significant amount, those are major changes, and if you don't want a bad safety outcome, you need to really carefully plan for that. You can't assume that all your processes will work. Is this unique to mining? No. We have evidence across a range of industries of this connection if you give people incentive pay, it undermines health and safety. Across a range. This is not unique. So if it wasn't operating in mining, you really would be unique. You would be the only industry where it doesn't work that way. And that would take a bit of explaining. But just to give you one example, because trucking is another industry I've looked. If you pay a truck driver by the kilometres they drive, which is a common method of payment, even for employee drivers, and that rate's not particularly high, what's going to happen? They're going to drive a lot of hours and outside their regulatory requirements. And is that going to be safe and health for them? No. So this is one we really need. We can make the mining industry even more productive and profitable and being, but if we need to do that by driving safety, because that's the way, because if you drive safety and you move back up to your higher order controls, we can do that. And we can become an absolute emblem for every other industry how to do that. But we need to put the bean counters in their place and tell them saving money over the next 12 months is not the critical issue. It's saving money over the next 2 to 5 years that is much more important. And that a short-term solution is only ever used when you can't get to the better order solution straight away, and it's not into the off a distance past where maybe if things go right, because it'll never happen that way. And the other observation I'll give, and Heather did an interview, she went onto mine sites and they said, yeah, safety trumps production every time. Then she went and did focus groups with the supervisors, they weren't underground, they're open cut as well, supervisors and the workers, focus groups. What did they tell her? Which was trumping. So as long as we recognise Voldemort is there, we can deal with it. If we pretend Voldemort isn't there, we're asking for trouble. The seventh phase, now Martin and Peter will leave the room at this point, is we're talking about regulatory failure. Now this is not an excuse that it's all due to the regulator, but there are regulatory contributions to fatal events, okay? Now the one that you often get is that there's not enough feedback, or there should be a new guidance note issued in this area because we've discovered a hazard which isn't just relevant to our site, it's relevant, and I'll give you an example of one where West Australia has learned a lesson, but the very smart East Coast haven't learnt that same lesson. There are other ones where there are gaps in your regulation and your legislation. Tasmania is still in that position. New Zealand was in that position prior to Pike River. It took 29 deaths to fix up their mine safety legislation. And also the other one is your inspectorate is either under-resourced. Now when I raised this with Martin, he said, I said, you won't have that problem in West Australia. You've got so many, they do. You know, you're running at about 60%, isn't that right, Martin? Yep, 60% of establishment. That's not good. I had a lot of disagreements with the senior manager at Beaconsfield, but he was a representative of the mine industry, and one thing good he'd done has gone to the government and said, we need more mine inspectors. They are an incredible asset to your industry. The better trained, on site, spending time, they can be part, and the industry largely understands that, I will say. Not everybody, but the industry as a whole largely understands they're an asset. But they've got to have the right tools and use them effectively. The American Mines Inspectorate, it wasn't so much under-resourcing, it's just bad, not having the right tools, because you need a different tool for every situation. So you need about 8 different tools. And they didn't. And they didn't use the tools they had effectively. So that can be a major problem. The pathway 8, when there is a problem in a mine, workers are seldom asked did they have, or supervisors or consultants are not asked whether they had prior concerns. Again, this is a key. We did at Beaconsfield, we did very rigorous, and we corroborated the evidence. And I'll show you later how I did that. But you can. But it's very seldom asked in single fatality incidents. Were there concerns prior to the event? But I'll show you there should have been concerns in a number of these incidents. Pathway 9, critical information flows. A lack of communication and trust. Now, this is not just about union management argy-bargy. It can be, but more in a concern if the union's influence in a place or is marginalised than just a disagreement. But it can also be failure of information flows at shift changeovers, where critical information from the prior shift should have been passed on. This is has anybody had failure to, how many people are going to put their hands up and said they've had issues with information in shift changeovers? And it can be just poor, so it can be poor communication at a range of levels. Now I'll go back to the argy-bargy one. A safe workplace is one where there's avenues for constructive dissent. You need alternate viewpoints. Consensus decision making has led to a number of disasters where there's been a series of events and there's been 2 scenarios, an optimistic scenario and a very pessimistic scenario, but parties have decided to take the optimistic scenario. Deepwater Horizon was one, Texas City refinery explosion was another. No one asked, look, yeah, this all fit, that fits that scenario, but there's an entirely different scenario that also fits all the stuff you're citing, which is not so optimistic. So you want to value constructive dissent. And systems and workplaces are only as safe as their feedback loops. So I'm going to go ahead a bit and talk about the 4 critical feedback loops that you have in your mind, or processing plan, or workplace, whatever, high hazard workplace. 1 is your internal monitoring systems and your worker feedback where people make observations or complaints or whatever. 2 is your independent auditing. You want an auditor that's going to ask you uncomfortable questions. You do not want an auditor or a consultant who's going to come in and confirm your prejudices. 3, your inspector, your independent inspectorate. 4, your HSR or union feedback from those loops. Okay, you want constructive dissent. You want people who are caring about safety, and all those groups that I've just mentioned should care about safety, but they'll might have a slightly different take, as Martin has already said. And normally in lots of workplaces when I go out with a HSR and the manager, and there is a huge amount of agreement. But there are disagreements on occasion, and that's good. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a strength. That's a democratic mechanism, and we want it. Because that's what makes our society stronger overall. That we don't have perfect decision making, but democratic processes are stronger in the long term than all the authoritarian decision making systems in the world. So we want that, we want to treasure it. And why do we need 4? Because unfortunately they're not all going to work. But if you've got 4 in place, the chances of them all 4 failing, we need them on every high hazard workplace, not just mines in my view, the chances of all 4 of them failing, and I can give you some evidence later on this, is really, really, really remote. But I'll go ahead to that. Queensland, I did a major study of their health and safety reps, but as part of that we looked at all the government inspection reports for a number of mines and the site safety reps, your HSRs, and all the industry safety reps, which are permanent safety reps like your old workman inspectors. And we looked at them between 1990, late 90s and 2011. There were 1,100 reports I waded through. And I identified 8 incidents where, even after the new legislation was brought in, they had gone that close to a fatal event. And it had been brought back at the very last minute. I think in 1 or 2 cases the company went whoops and did it. And you can guess in the others it was a mixture of either the safety rep, the industry rep, or the government inspector who said, no, that's not, we're going to stop at this point. That's a really serious situation that's developing. So they had all the good systems in place, but they corrode and they had that final fail-safe. Now you don't really want to have to rely on that final fail-safe, but in a high hazard industry you need it. Oh, by the way, the last one is of course the one I didn't want to talk about as a safety prevention guy, is what happens when everything goes pear-shaped. You need to have a system in place that will help people in that situation. A good rescue system. And look, on that point, who's got refuge chambers? How long does the oxygen last in a refuge chamber? Yeah. How long were the guys underground at Beaconsfield? 11 days. Okay, so don't put all your reliance on refuge chambers. They can be great in some circumstances, but if there's a long period of entrapment without an oxygen supply, a refuge chamber is not going to save you. So just bear that one in mind. I think that's it for me. That is me for today. Well, not today, but for now.
Do a Q&A.
Oh, Q&A. Oh, okay.
Q&A, right.
Yep. Oh, yeah, that's right.
Around the room. I've realised that I'll never be emeritus. To be a has-been, you must once have been, so that's me out. Quick reminder on the Slido app, there's, if you haven't used it before, there's a couple of tabs at the top. It automatically flicks to the poll when there's a poll question, so we're getting some of the answers through to Martin's initial question in the Q&A. So if there is a poll, just wait till you see that question come up on your Slido. So I've had a few questions come through already. If you have got any, now's a good time to pop those up.
All right. I don't want to look at them. No, it's not.
I can ask the first one while we get this sorted. Call me Dorothy with this one because it's a question of mine. I've noticed since I've been in the industry and not a proliferation but an emergence of finance people in senior executive positions. Generally we see them on boards, but we're starting to see them in managing director positions on site, and we're losing sort of the operational technical aspect that are managing some mines. Probably fits into Pathway 6, but what are your thoughts on that, Michael?
It worries me because they're trained narrowly. I mean, finance was taught at UNSW in the business school, and they're only taught financial risk, and they don't understand other hazards and risks that the organisation faces. They understand nothing about health and safety. How many companies that you work for has a health and safety expert on the board? No, there were 2. I saw 2. Yeah, good. Because you actually need, this is part of constructive dissent and information, you need somebody with that expertise on the board to explain to these people the areas of hazard and risk they don't understand. So one of the changes I'd love to see is more that every board, particularly in high hazard industries, should have a health and safety expert on their board. But yet we're getting too much bean counters. and not enough sustainability, which is why I like engineers, because they like sustainability and they like redundancy. And to give you an example of not understanding redundancy, you know that Sydney's been having a whole series of building collapses or building serious engineering failures. Because of mates in construction, I have some very close contacts in the building industry, and one very senior building industry executive went onto one of those sites. Do you know what the redundancy was in that building? 0 redundancies. Now, no professional engineer, in my view, would ever design a building with 0 redundancies. Yeah.
Thanks for that. We've got a few more questions coming in. Another one, are the 10 pathways in order of hierarchy? 10 the highest and 1 the lowest?
No. I did try to organise them in a way, but they're not in order, in hierarchy of importance. Engineering, I always thought engineering was going to be important. I wanted to have that up in front because I thought that I was writing a book not for academics. I was a senior professor. I had no real more brownie points that I needed. But I wanted, because I was in health and safety as you are, I wanted to write things that were going to make for you. So this was written for the industry. It wasn't written for academics. There are bits in it there for academics. You know, I am an academic, I'm going to play that game. But it was largely written for you. So I wanted engineering up the top because it is an important one. But the others, look, in terms of the tie-up with the regs, in terms of the tie-up of the incidents, they weren't tied up in that way. Obviously, risk analysis, management systems and auditing go together, as we will hear later today, and that's why they're together. But there's no a special order. But an important point is they interact.
Yep.
Don't think these are self-standing. They do interact. If you're cost cutting, for example, your maintenance it could be at risk. If your risk assessment is crap, your management system is going to be fundamentally flawed. So they do interact, and you need to be aware of that. And Heather, who was my PhD student who wrote a PhD applying the 10 pathways, she's actually trying to tease out some of the interactions. And she's written one article in Safety Science, which is listed in the package you'll get. And I, along with Tanya's paper, I really recommend you read it. Heather Jackson's her name. She came out of the industry, came out of the inspectorate, so she's got all that practical background. And she's working on the next paper. You'll be pleased to know it's focusing on regulatory failure. So she's, and another one will be on contractors, which is a big issue that will come up. And Safety Science, which Tanya's and Heather's paper in, is one of the premier safety journals in the world. So I won't say everything in it is great, but it's some very, very good stuff. And to give you an indication of Heather's impact of her article, shortly after she published that article in Safety Science, she got contacted by a senior expert in the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health in the US, which is also the Centres for Disease Control as part of that. And she said, loved your paper, can you write us a chapter for a book? Now, it isn't a NIOSH book, but it's a book being edited by NIOSH people. So and so what you're getting with when you read her paper, it's detailed in a technical sense that I know you people are going to love, because she really does understand. And that's one of the reasons I would love to get her across here to talk to you, and particularly about remedies and how the transmission belts of the pathways go. The other point I'll make, just to finish this off, is that in any one pathway, you can have multiple flaws. So it's not like you've got one pathway with one flaw. You can have multiple flaws on the same pathway.
Thanks for that, Michael. Quick one maybe for either or both of you. Do the fatality statistics include mine site workers that die from non-natural, non-work-related causes?
No, they don't. And again, that's a reason why in our current review we are a little hesitant about publishing some of the statistics, because there's still a question with at least 3 of the recent fatalities as to whether they were work-related or natural causes.
Back to Michael, can you please expand on the differences between pathways 8 and 9?
Pathway 8 is really the relationship between the people managing risk and the people at risk. So it's a broader concept. It's not just workplaces, but it isn't just workers reporting issues. It's supervisors, consultants, anyone in the workplace basically. So when I did prepare it and I wrote the book, I was probably more focused on that worker management connection. But even then I recognised, particularly with Pike River, it was the hydro manager who actually left because he was under consultant. So that sort of feedback is really important. It was just that when people, anyone on site is telling you, I don't think this site is or this mine is safe, you should be listening to that carefully and at least investigating it. The other one is directly more the relationship between management and workers. But even then there's a quirk to it because you can have poor worker-to-worker communication in shift changes and between teams. So I hope that explains the difference. Yep.
Thanks for that. There's a lot of good questions coming in. We've probably only got time for one or two more. Has a high influx of new or green workers to mining played a part in tipping the scales of competency?
Look,
Has
this
it
is,
involved in fatalities?
well, Martin will have something to say about this, but there is a general health and safety literature. There's a paper by Peter Smith I read about a decade ago. He's an Australian, he lives in Canada, he's a health and safety expert. It wasn't quite massacre of the innocents, but it was that across industry, new people going into a work site are at higher risk. It isn't just inexperience of the industry, and it's not just age, it's not just younger workers. Even older workers unfamiliar with a work site are at higher risk. So that is a particular challenge, and we'll talk about one incident today where that led to a fatality. But as the industry is booming now and expanding rapidly, it's something that we really need to look at. And by the way, the same is happening in Tasmania, because Tasmania, like you, on a smaller scale, has a lot of minerals which are now, for the post-carbon economy, absolutely critical. And I went down a nickel mine quite recently. We've got tungsten and we've got a number of other things. So there's a mineral boom going on in Tasmania. And I think Australia, if you want to control the Pacific, you control Australia, basically for a whole lot of reasons. But one is it has all the critical minerals that you need.
And look, we will dive deeper into that question as well after the break. But suffice to say, from an inspector's perspective, I don't think in my memory the industry has been more vulnerable as a result of any experience.
Okay, here's one we have talked about, and we've got some agreement here. Has ISO 31000 been a help or a hindrance to WHS and fatality reduction?
Do you want to go first, Martin?
Quickly, I got to tell you, if when the inspectorates start walking around, if you start waving the 5 ticks in our face, that'll be the first cross. All right, there is little belief, little faith that an ISO certification of your management system is going to carry the day. Yep. I'll leave it at that. But hey, that's probably a conversation over a beer later on. But there are many reasons why. Yeah.
I'll give you a more generic point. When I used to teach organisational risk, I looked at a lot of the ISO certifications, and the general conclusion was that they were largely paper driven, and that often some of the people doing this is not just mines, but in more general, there's the people doing the certification didn't have sufficient expertise to really understand the ongoing hazards and processes. So be wary.
And I think, to paraphrase you, Pete, apart from the fact that there's an element of trinket collection around the five ticks, and it looks great up on the wall, it's more of a financial benefit to the business than it is a safety and health benefit. It's, we need to have this as part of a tender submission or something. Yeah, I have very little faith in it.
You guys keep stealing my quotes. You're going to leave me with nothing to say. Look, there's been some good questions. Thank you for those. If you like some of them, give them the thumbs up, because I'm filtering these through sort of relevancy and popularity. So keep doing those or keep popping those in. Thank you for that. We might throw back to Michael now to talk about some specific examples and where the 10 pathways fit in. Thank you.
Fabulous.
Okay, thanks. It's not working. It's not working. I'm pressing the green button. I have a PhD in green buttons and it's not working. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, we are. So those are the 5 cases I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about some more in terms of principal mining hazards, but these are 5 I'm going to talk about briefly now. So this was the one that I missed. It was an air blast after a fall in a caving, block caving. And the height of the void and the location of the bulkhead. 4 workers were killed. Parks. Oh, sorry, it's at North Parks. This is in a western gold mining area of New South Wales. And the barrier of the bulkhead barrier was too low, and that should have been known that this pathway 3, there was a failure to assess the risk of the void and the bulkhead barrier, and there was a loss of a qualified expert that might have been able to help. There have been other mine incidents, I remember 2 on the west coast of Tasmania, where they'd removed expertise off-site, their engineers, and that can be critical in terms of things. And in other areas too. Anybody remember the Longford explosion? 1998? They relocated the engineers to Melbourne. They could only communicate with the operators via computer or phone. Every high hazard workplace I've walked in, not just mines, there's a critical conversation between the operators and the engineers. The engineers know safety critical stuff that the operators don't know. Fortunately at Longford, and this is not a widely known story, but I interviewed one of the operators. They saw, after the initial explosion, a haze appearing and starting to envelop the area. They knew what that haze was, hydrocarbons. They knew further, very critically, that this would find a point of ignition. They ducked. There would have been more killed at Longford had not the operators all ducked below the glass for where they were. So pathway 4, there was poor management of contractors. We're going to get and this, for the Grosvenor inquiry, I was asked to actually write a report on all the evidence on that, and hopefully I can talk about that at some other point. Inadequate recognition of caving by in the system. Pathway 6. Production rate was taking precedence over safety in the caving problem, and air blast risk was well known. Voldemort appears. Pathway 7, the inspectors had an inadequate knowledge of block caving. And pathway 9, there was poor management, worker communication and worker communication on that site. Mount Thorley, this is the one where the East Coast never learns from the West Coast. I was talking to West Coast miners about 2 months ago in Rosebery. West Coast Tasmania, everybody thinks, when you say West Coast, they always think WA. In Tasmania, we have a more parochial view of the West Coast. It's about 3.5 hours away. And I said, I gave this incident and I said, I'll get onto it. I said, there's a standard in WA. There isn't a standard in Tasmania, Queensland, New South Wales, although this is a New South Wales incident. And when I presented in Queensland, the Queensland guy said, yep, we've had those. But Heather found in her study, which I'm taking some of these out of her paper, or her report and PhD, WA's got a standard, and I said to the West Coast guys, I said, they've got a standard, I don't know why. And they replied as one and said, Mount Keith, which was an incident where a large vehicle went in to avoid a sump, 18 minutes deep, no chance of a survive from that. And I actually, interesting enough, spoke to the inspector that investigated Mount Keith yesterday. That's the great thing of coming. You meet people that have got critical knowledge, and I found out things I didn't know about Mount Keith. So now every time I give this talk, I say WA's got a standard thanks to Mount Keith. But do we need to wait on the East Coast till we get a fatality before we do something about it? Now let's go through it. They didn't examine water management issues, including rain events, because apparently it never rains on the East Coast, or the Hunter Valley, where this mine was. They did some risk assessment of the pit rating. They were mainly concerned of somebody damaging their neck or back if they were driving some equipment that went into the pit, the sump. Not the danger of getting drowned. They erected some temporary barriers and signage. There's a number of incidents where this is inadequate. Okay, you've really got to look at that closely. By the way, that West Coast meeting was mainly about voids. I was talking about 10 pathways, but they were mainly looking at voids and browse and how to deal with safety there. And some good solutions were coming out, and they weren't just administrative controls. So we're talking about removing workers and surveyors and others who were getting close to voids and keeping them right away, and building better barriers so that no one could get too close, and then inspecting them to make sure they weren't getting close. So again, I went away thinking, great, we can at least partly engineer out some of these problems. But in this case, there were flaws in the communication between shifts. The previous supervisor raised an issue that had not been communicated. Those flaws in the risk assessment. Increased rate of overburden removal. This might have been Voldemort, we're not sure, but there was a increased bullying harassment, which you can get when you're really under the gun. Couldn't show there's a direct connection, but it just was an interesting coincidence. Failure 7. There was no, I've already dealt with. New South Wales had no guidance on this area, although there was a good reason to have guidance in this area. Pathway 8. The previous shift supervisor had raised the issue, but it hadn't got transferred on. Pathway 9. This is a serendipitous escape, and I'm going to come to more. We always think of the fatal incidents where someone's done something contrary to rules or silly, and that's put them in harm's way. What we don't think about are the miraculous escapes, or the times that workers make judgments that avoid a hazardous event. And they're those two. But in this one, the guy rings up, I'm in the sump, I'm going underwater, come and rescue me quick. The rescue team goes to the wrong spot, arrives too late. So how did he survive? Well, due to some prior training, he couldn't open the doors because of the water pressure, but he knew that eventually the water pressure would equalise and he'd be able to open the door. The water would be right up here at that point. So how many are going to stay calm in that situation? Oh, it's all right, but when just before I'm about to drown, I'll be able to get out. That takes some real calm. So every system failed, but there wasn't a fatality because of the calm thinking of the operator. And there should have been a whole lot of different things. That comes straight out of Heather's work. Okay, we go to copper mines at Cobar, Western New South Wales, another one of Heather's. Worker was sucked into an underground sump and drowned. Now this is another good one where you've got an action by a worker which was hazardous, but there was a really dangerous system in place before that situation. So he lost his scaling bar in the sump and became concerned that it would flow through to the lower level and injure somebody, and that he was worried he might get sanctioned, so he went in to try and retrieve it and was drowned. Okay. but there was a whole failure in planning, risk control and feedback prior to that event. And that's the other thing in lesson, that people will actually do things that put themselves in harm's way because they're trying to do the right thing. They think they're trying to do the right thing even though they're not. Thing had been, the sump been purposely blocked to stop inundation into a lower level. There was a lack of coordination between the engineering and the production personnel about water management and the impact of continued production on water accumulation. Pretty basic. There was no safe work procedure. We're going to hit this one later. Too often, workers are asked to do a JSA. A JSA is for where it's an unexpected situation that you had. This was not an unexpected situation. This should have had a safe work procedure. Far too much use of JSAs. They didn't get fit for purpose equipment, let alone didn't identify it or procure it. They weren't, I don't know if I come on to this later, they hadn't identified what they blocked the sump with and what was the most appropriate way of unblocking the sump plug. Yeah. You'll get all the detail for these and also more in Heather's paper. So, there was a lack of a task-specific risk assessment. There was not even a broad brush risk assessment on dewatering. There were feedback failures. There was a failure to record and transfer information in the system. There was a failure to monitor water build-up. Now, a number of the fatalities in WA, although it's a dry state, are inundation incidents. Just to give you another one, the last major fatality incident in New South Wales was Gretley. And it's some lessons here, and that's why I'm going to introduce it into this example. They were working a mine. This occurred in 1996, and it was in a mine in the Hunter Valley, not that far from the Hunter River. And there were old mining commenced in the Hunter Valley in the very early 19th century. The first recorded fatality in the Hunter Valley is 1816, mine fatality. There's probably once before that. So there was an older working from the 1890s, ironically called the young Townsend working. I'd hate to see where the old Townsend workings were. The mine maps indicated it was 100 metres away from the new workings. Do we rely on maps of old workings? Do we always trust maps of new workings? Do we always assume that old mine workings are flooded? They were a few metres away. There had been accumulations of water reported by the deputy, unusual. There were no telltale holes drilled, and there was an inrush of water, and 4 miners were blown away, basically, in that incident. So there are obviously lessons that we know. This is a different sort of incident, but inrush or people getting drowned in mines, really, we should be doing better at it. What else to say? Oh, yes. We have compliance targets for hazard identification and JSAs, and monitoring is identifying a very low level of compliance, so what do we do about it? Nothing. So that's a systems failure, a serious systems failure. What's the point of having non-compliance data if you don't actually use it for anything? So pathways 2, 5, 6 and 7 were present. In this case there was no prosecution because the worker had entered the sump contrary to the mine's rules. But there's a broader failure here. This was an unsafe workplace, an unsafe system of work, and that was fundamental. So let's go to Ulan Underground, where subcontractors are doing some work on site, survey work I think it was, testing service subcontractor. Is injured when a swage pipe end fitting that was coupled to a compressed air supply via a flexible hose suddenly separated, and as an engineer would know, released a lot of energy, and it sent him to the ground. Of course, this one's a coal, but I mean, you can get the same incidents on a metalliferous open cut. Inadequate engineering standards. The pipe which was used to deliver the inert gas was manufactured outside designer specifications. Now, manufacturers, designers set specifications, and you generally should abide by them or go one step further. Dreamworld. There were manufacturer specifications for minimum operator numbers on their equipment, which the company decided not to follow. So there was an engineering, design failure there. Now, you can probably guess why they might have done that. Failed to ensure competency and provide the supervisor of workers undertaking tasks. We're going to talk about that sort of issue in other incidents. The manufacturer's risk assessment was actually underspecified. The mine risk assessment failed to identify risks associated with using compressed air, and there was an alternative, soapy water, which at least should have been looked at. And the subcontractor's informal risk assessment. Do subcontractors use informal risk assessment on site? Didn't identify the risk of sudden separation of swage fittings. Well, that's a repeat. Martin, you've revised this one several times, but that repeat keeps reappearing. Or maybe that's Voldemort giving me a message. There was a documented safe work procedure, but the information given to the subcontractor failed to include control measures following a previous incident. A lack of consultation between the engineering manager and the technical services department, and there were actions taken to use non-metallic pipes and with factory swage fittings, not field swage ends, and there was an enforceable undertaking, which I imagine you all understand what that is. Okay. The Mount Arthur coal mine, again, this is a tyre handler, so it's something that would be found on metalliferous sites as well. Tyre replacement contract worker was severely burnt while refuelling when a heavy vehicle refuelling station using a free flow adapter nozzle that bypassed the automatic cutoff, the adapter, and because he was using it on the heavy vehicle fueling, which was not where he should have been doing the refueling. The adapter, forces acting on the adapter caused it to eject from the fueling neck, and diesel fuel entered the hot engine bay with entirely predictable results. Inadequate engineering standards. There was no system to prevent access to the heavy vehicle refueling station, and subcontractors were not trained in its safe use anyway. Pathway 3, there was a lack of task-specific risk assessment. The risk was not identified, and refueling was rated as a low-risk activity. Pathways 4 and 5, feedback failures. There's a lack of clearly documented communication to refuelers about their responsibility to refuel tyre handlers. Management was unaware that contractors were using the heavy vehicle refuel station. Some of you are thinking, system auditing at this point. How long was this going on? Short answer, a long time. Audits failed to identify, apropos the last point, non-approved adapter being used. We've got a wonderful system, but there are things happening we don't know about. And the risk assessment supervision failed to provide the subcontractor with safe access to refuelling. There were workplace demands, and disorganisation contributed to the contractors using non-approved adapter. Why did this happen? Oh God, there's Voldemort again. Work pressure. The tyre handler refuelling required to respond to an urgent service request. Or more generally, they were using the heavy vehicle refuelling point because it was quicker to get access to that than the one they were supposed to be using. So they were trying to get a job done fast, and there was a more general problem there. There were prior concerns, so Pathway 8 was there. And what happened after the incident? The contractor provided a dedicated refuelling cart for tyre handlers. Engineering solution, problem. A mining company audit later identified non-approved adapters in use at other mines. There's a more general point here. If someone is committing an offence on site and you need to sanction them, you better find out the backstory first, because there may be a bigger systems problem that you're not aware of. There was a West Coast mine, there was a guy playing with the tags, you know how important that is in an underground mine. 2 surveyors were down when they were doing some using explosives. So he was sacked, but it wasn't good, because they found out, the inspector later found out, there had been systemic use of tags on site. So there's a broader problem. We don't want to drop down to the third world problem where they have a disaster in a third world country and it becomes too public. So they take 3 senior managers and prosecute them, and nothing else changes. The regulations, the corruption, everything else that led to that incident is not attended to, but you've got your sacrificial lambs. They may be complicit, but that doesn't really deal with the problem. But it looks good from a media spin point of view.
So hello again, everyone. Thank you for sticking to our timelines. It's terrific. Thanks to the Pan Pacific folks. That morning tea was absolutely lovely. Thank you. Okay, so time for me now to just reflect again on some historical performance here. And can I just get a show of hands? Who knows that we've actually support a fatalities register on our website, and who here's used it? There's probably about a third of the room that know that it's there. So on the Demers website, you'll actually find this fatalities hazard register. It is up to date until 2018. The reason for that is we've obviously had other priorities, the WHS legislation being foremost amongst them, that have taken away from getting this updated. But we do have a project underway now to revisit the data and to repopulate that, and also to replicate the previous report on serious and fatalities that we published. Now this was released in 2014, so we do it about every 10 years. It's about time that this new one comes out. So that project's going to be doing 2 things: updating that register and then revising that publication. So in that period covered by the register from 2000 to 2018, there's details of 71 fatal accidents, and in those details It also includes what we have assessed as being the contributing factors to those events, and also an analysis of the worker cohorts that were most represented. This next slide, again, if you're going to be taking something back to your workplace, this is another photo opportunity for you. You want to take some data back, but remembering that it is between 2000 and 2018 and needs to be updated. So which were the occupation groups that were most represented in that fatalities register? So you can see that fitters were clear of the pack, followed by underground operators. And then surface operations, whether you're a driver or an operator, if you combine those, they are the biggest cohort. But again, we can split and cut our data to suit. Any managers and supervisors in the room? Are you a little alarmed by what's that? The fifth line down there, that there was 7 managers or supervisors in our data set. Any idea as to, you reckon, why managers and supervisors be represented? Shout them out if you've got an idea. There we go. We go out and do the things we won't let other people do. Roll up our sleeves and dive in, right? Whether we're ready for it or not. So there's a little lesson there for those who are in a leadership role as well. So Tanya Jenke, as I said, and remember, just so that we're clear on this, there are 2 research projects that are in parallel. So Jenke is focused upon the West Australian experience, and she is supervised by Dr. Marcus Catani, who's in the audience here somewhere with us. Hello, Marcus. Whereas Heather Jackson is being supervised by Michael Quinlan and looking at the New South Wales experience. And there will be a project at some point comparing those 2 sets of data. But what Tanya has found is that 66% of the fatal incidents in our register include multiple versions of the pathways present. 18% found that there was at least one pathway present, and 15% couldn't be identified from the original data. So what Tanya did was to do a deep dive into the description of the event and then try to, extend that description to suit the pathway profile. So in WA then we've got these 2 things that are happening. Number 1 has been the feedback from the questionnaire, 2017, 18, 19 roadshows, and then the data from the register. And again, another photo opportunity coming up. What that research has found is that every pathway is important, okay? Let's make sure we got that. But 4 of them are emerging as critical weaknesses for the sector to grapple with in the here and now. The first pathway is pathway 1, and Michael has already unpacked what that means. And remembering, of course, that number 1, our fitters are overrepresented in the statistics, and number 2, that failures of maintenance were also a significant contributing factor, the second highest profile one. Pathway 9, we come down in terms of poor management, worker communication and trust. It was the 3rd lowest mean in the roadshow surveys. Was really skewed. Some sectors, when we've gone and visited those different regions around the state, some of them had excessively high levels of worker trust. Others, it was just terrible. And I think I'm not giving away secrets, but Michael will be coming back in September. He'll be addressing the Future of Mining conference, and we'll be talking to some of the findings from the roadshow. But when we were in Karratha, this pathway number 9 averaged 8 out of 10. It became a point of contention in terms of, are you sure that the levels of trust are that high here? And prevailing, the feedback was, we stopped the questionnaire, had a conversation about it, and I don't think there was a worker in the room that didn't say that said that they wouldn't be supported if they stopped work. And I mean, it was a great takeaway. It's a fabulous positive indicator, but not our experience in other sectors. I just want to quickly focus on pathway 4 and pathway 5. Pathway 4 is failures in the management system, and pathway 5 is failures in the auditing of that management system. We had that great question before about auditing. But this is troublesome from an inspectorate's perspective. Why? Well, Peter's going to elaborate on why in just a moment, but seriously, we are 18 months into the new legislation, and the mine safety management system is the fundamental pivot point around the new legislation. And what you've been telling us and what's come out of the review of the register is that is the weak point. And for me, the planets start to align here now. We're pushing, saying, hey, these folks have got it, and your roadshow participants are saying, in fact, if we do have a weak point, it's that. So understandably, we're a little anxious about what the next little while's got in front of us. Can I also say, though, that you're not alone. In the review that Michael did of the performance in other countries, Pathway 1, again, which is in 94 to 95% of all of the events he's analysed, was there. But Pathway 4 was also frequently identified as a pattern as well. So here we've got, first of all, an opportunity to learn from how the other international mining sectors are performing and what they're doing to address weaknesses in Pathway number 4. But if they're not all that good, then we've actually got a real opportunity, as Michael's already alluded to actually lead the world in getting this right. So there's a dual opportunity there for us. So without any further ado, let me invite Team Leader Peter Nissen, who is our WHS management system guy, come up and talk to you a little bit more about that particular part. Join me.
Thanks for the applause up front. There might not be any required at the end. I hope you're getting a sense of how we're trying to build the 10 pathways into the WA scenario. So examining the fatalities register is critical. The work that Marcus Catani did with the roadshow data from 17, 18 and 19 is feeding in. Martin will talk a bit later on about an opportunity for you to run this survey at your own organisations. But I want to tie it back to a legislative basis as well. I suppose that came from thinking about Pathway 7 and wondering whether we've got regulatory gaps. If the pathways are screaming out, here's what goes wrong, I wanted, I suppose, to satisfy myself that all those aspects were covered adequately in the legislation. So we've started down that journey, and I'll probably focus more on the 4 critical ones that Martin talked about. But if you go looking, they're all there, and I'll hopefully cover them all off today. So the first one is the duty to identify hazards and manage risks to health and safety. That's clearly pathway number 3, and there's obligations there. I won't read a bunch of these things out at you. You can go and look those up yourselves. Martin's already talked about where pathway 4 sits in terms of the management system. That's covered in those regulations. If you haven't read those, I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll spend a bit of time talking about the review and performance standards and audit part. Michael's already alluded to how critical that is. So I'll give you, as I've got a soapbox, I'll give you some of my thoughts on that one. Again, Martin's talked about this, and I might suggest that if you need me to stand here and tell you at this stage of the implementation, we were 18 months into a 2-year transition. If you need me to tell you what a management system is, you're probably hurtling headlong down pathway number 4 towards your next death or disaster. So I won't suggest that. I'll just reinforce again that it is the most critical bit of the new legislation. And just as a bit of a heads up, those are the sorts of things that should be contained in your management system. So you should know about the 5 additional plans that may or may not be relevant to everybody, but you do have to have principal mining hazard management plans. I will talk about those in a minute. Emergency management plan, that's pathway 10. You should have those in place already. And health management plans, which we've been pushing for quite a while. And I don't know if you've mentioned it yet at this session, Michael, but he talks about the pathways fitting very well into occupational health and hygiene scenarios as well. Focusing on, I suppose, pathway number 5 and the audit and review part, which Michael pointed out as critical. Our data telling us that it's one of the 4 critical ones in WA. I want to highlight the 3 areas of review that the legislation talks about. The first one might be the lowest level of review, but it's the most critical one for me, and it's covered in, pardon me, Regs 38 and 618 that talk about when to review your controls, and your controls being obviously what your management system is about. I will read that regulation out at you just briefly to tie them all together. Reg 38 says a duty holder, the room's full of those, must review and as necessary revise your control measures if a control measure does not control the risk and if a new or relevant risk or hazard is identified at your business. So very clearly that's covering pathway number 3. Okay, that sounds good. That sounds better. So apologies if everything was quiet down the back there at the earlier session. If a notifiable incident occurs at your site, you have to review your control measures. So that feeds into the early warning signs and pathway number 2. If a health or safety rep raises or requests a review of your control measures, you need to review your control measures. That's a new power that health and safety reps have. Have we got any health and safety reps in the room at the moment? There's a few. That's a good turnout. That's actually more than we've had in Perth previously, so thank you for that. Did you realise you had that sort of new power? It might be an interesting one to try and wield, but I suppose that feeds into that pathway 8 if there's enough trust. Number 9, if there's enough trust in the business that you can do that, you should be able to do that. So that one's covering that pathway number 8. If there's a change to your system of work, process or a procedure, you need to review your control measures. So that probably fits into the engineering, technical, maintenance space at pathway number 1. Is someone ticking them off? Because I'm getting there. We talked about an audit or review of the effectiveness of your management system. So that's pathway 5, and that's what I'll spend a bit of time in a minute. This is where we come in. Pathway number 7, if a regulator requests a review of your control measures, you need to do a review of your control measures. So we've got that one covered there as well. This is my first James Reason point. I'm not smarter than James Reason, but I've got a couple of questions there. The model to me seems to push people to add more controls. The theory thinking, well, I've got these holes, they line up, I still haven't got control, I better add another control. I'm not a big fan of that. The model doesn't push you to decrease the size of the holes in the cheese that you've already got. And this control or review control process is critical in that space of making sure your controls are better, tighter, more implementable, more sustainable, more monitorable, that sort of thing. Rather than adding layers and layers and layers and layers of cheese, you don't want your management system to turn into this fromage mahal of controls. I'll just give you that. If your management system looks like that, you've got too much cheese. And I hesitate to suggest we should undo some of the controls we've got, but before you add anything new, I'd really look to reducing the holes in the cheese that you do have and tightening up the controls. The audit bit, so the second level of review, there's some regulations around that. They say you must set performance standards and have an audit process of your management system. So that's the formal review that Michael's talked about. It might tie up with some of the KPIs, so that was a good question that we had earlier. That ties in there nicely. But reviewing your management system is critical by an audit because I suppose I'll throw to Sid Decker. Who's heard of Sid Decker? Sid Decker talks about work as imagined versus work as done. Work as imagined is your management system, maybe written by some corporate bodies in Perth with no consultation with site. What happens at site could be a completely different thing. It's this is Camelot. This is what happens. So audits of your system are critical, but again, one of my thoughts on auditing, I've been guilty of this. When we do some of these official audits and formal audits of a business management system, often we only look for enough information to verify that control seems to be working. You've got a lot of criteria to audit. You maybe have a limited time to do it. You look at some examples of paperwork. You go and talk to some people. You interview some folks and go, yeah, I'll tick that one off. If we switch that around, thinking about how do you close the holes in the cheese, if your auditing approach is more, that control's got a fault in it somewhere. It's got a failure point. I'm going to audit till I find it. You'll probably find it. And that's where the latent, hidden failure system that Michael talked about, that's, these failures in the cheese, the Swiss cheese model with the latent failures, they're not hidden failures. If you go looking for them, you'll find them. So I think that's another critical point. Hands up on the work as imagined versus work as done. Pop your hand up if you believe you have people at your site that don't follow all your procedures 100% of the time. And every hand should be up. Again, work as imagined versus work as done. And I should also probably not suggest if you just had your hand up, you're starting to build your own case of negligence. As a regulator, I wouldn't say that. But have a think about that. How do we allow that to happen? How do we willingly know that we have procedures that don't work and we know it? Are we acting on it? Reviewing those control measures, auditing your systems, that'll get you to that point. There's some other tie-ins to the, pardon me, to the legislation. Contractor management systems, and we haven't yet talked about contractor management. Some of their previous sessions have asked if contractor management is pathway number 11, and Michael might talk about that in a little while. Regulation 625 talks about the interplay between your management system and contractor safety management plans. So if you haven't understood that one, get your heads across that one, because it's probably a big change in how things operate. Pathway number 10 is covered in your emergency plan, so we're starting to get all of these ones in there. There's some increased requirements also in the legislation for communication and consultation. So they're in sections 47, 8 and 9 of the Act. They go to pathways 8 and 9, communication with employees, and if you've got good communication processes, good supervision, you build up that level of trust and communication between the business. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 and 9 that we've covered. And the Voldemort pathway, Reg 675, everything's in 675. ZE talks about providing sufficient financial resources to manage risks at your business. The main one where I see this one coming into play is duties of company officers. And one of these sessions we did for an industry group asked, hey, why are there no directors in the room? Because this message really should be getting to them. And it's probably a good point. But company officers, under their requirements for due diligence, have to do a few things. They're required to have knowledge of OSH matters. So that's probably a general knowledge so that they can at least understand any issues that come to them on that basis. They're required to understand the hazards and risks associated with the business. So how many of them are finance people, which we've sort of talked about, sitting in a Perth office, really don't have any understanding of how the business operates. Here's the one, they're required to ensure the PCBU has sufficient resources to minimise risks as low as reasonably practical. So that's where Pathway 6 comes in pretty clearly. So I'm happy now that we've got all of them covered. We haven't looked yet, and Michael's quite excited that we're talking about this stuff, and we'll go looking for more and try and we're thinking about building a self-assessment to all of the pathways against the legislation and trying to help in that regard, but that's a piece of work yet to happen. But I'll talk about principal mining hazards and get back to the death and disaster stuff. So this, underneath your management system, is a requirement that you've got to identify principal mining hazards. Some are laid out for you in the space of geotechnical issues and inrush, vehicle hazards, that sort of thing. But you've got to do a proactive risk assessment to identify your other hazards, and this feeds nicely into what Michael's talking about. In addition to identifying them, you've got to have a robust plan. And the last point here is that you've got to consider those principal hazards in association with your other principal hazards and every other hazard in your business. Much like all the pathways interplay, your hazards may interplay. And on the sort of note of most of these being around geotech or inrush hazards, or some of the specific ones that integrate, Michael, I'll throw to, because he's going to give us some more case studies, and a couple of these are specifically about inrush and some geotechnical issues. So that's me. I'll throw back to Michael.
So I'm going to talk about 4 incidents. Beaconsfield, which I lived and breathed for 8 months. The Cadia East mine at Orange. Pike River Underground Mine, our not to manage a mine, and Ravensworth, where there are 2 fatality incidents. Beaconsfield, that's the rescue. That's Brant and Todd emerging from the mine. That wasn't our job. Our job ended with the death of Larry Knight. They were operating. They were in a telehandler doing some support work. Larry was operating a telehandler. Todd and Brant were in the basket. Engineering design thing that was never reported. Shortly before the incident, they had done some reinforcement on that basket which is one of the reasons that Todd and Brandt survived. There was a significant seismic event about 9:25 and 9 o'clock in the evening and on the 925 level and also the 915 level. When you start to approach 1,000 metres underground in Tasmania, you reach a geotechnical active zone. So there was a large seismic event. There was a large rock fall. Larry Knight was killed. It wouldn't have mattered whether he was in the telehandler cab or not. He was actually working entirely to procedure. There was nothing, he'd done nothing wrong. And he was regarded by his fellow workmates as a good and safe work operator. So there was a fall of ground. They were trapped for 11 days and finally rescued by an emergency tunnel. Prior to that event, there had been a series of seismic events in the mine and also a series of rock falls. So there were incidents occurring that indicated there were issues. In October 2005, approximately 6 months before the fatal event, there was a very large rock fall in the 915 and the 925 levels, the same levels. And there were workers in that area, but they'd exited that area shortly before. The mine sent out 2 communications, one to its directors where it said this is a near-miss event that easily could have resulted in fatalities, four fatalities. They sent a different email to the workforce which didn't make that observation. So that's an interesting thing, that the financial people apparently needed more information than their own workforce. Now, were there warning signals? In the 30 months prior to that major fall, there were 24 reportable rock falls. There were others we uncovered in part of the investigation, smaller ones, scats, including a scats fall on the morning at that level. That struck me as a health and safety expert as rather meant a lot of unplanned falls of ground. I mean, ground's meant to fall in mines, but unplanned falls in any area of the mine tell you a story. I did ask some experts whether that was rather a lot, and they confirmed my suspicion that this was rather a lot. There was one on average every 6 weeks. Every 10 weeks there was a fall of average 50 tonnes. This had been going on. After the 2005 serious rockfall, the mine changed its mine methods. Okay, we'll get back on whether the risk assessment associated, they changed to what they called checkerboard mining. The rockfalls continued. There were 6 leading up to the fatal event in April. So this was not an incident without clear warning signals. Did they do a risk assessment? Well, they actually brought in a lot of experts, spent a fair bit of money after the October 2005 rockfall, but they didn't do a full risk assessment in 2 senses. One, they did not assess the adequacy of the existing ground support regime. Now, that's like failing risk management 101 in my view. And so when I taught risk assessment, that was one of the you look at the existing controls, that you have to. They had done a joint risk assessment of ground conditions in the mine or risks in the mine. Fire was rated 1. It was a very old mine, timber shafts, so that I accepted that. 2 was transport. 3 was ground control. I didn't understand that. In terms of multiple fatality events, ground control, ground rockfall was obviously a much more serious issue. They had no document of their risk assessment following the 2005 fall. I asked for it. They said they'd done it. They could find no evidence of it. Regulatory lesson number 1. If you have no evidence of a risk assessment, there was no risk assessment. That will be the conclusion. So they have brought in a lot of experts and looked at various issues, but they couldn't show me a document which even summarised the basic steps that you would do in a risk assessment following a major event. And they didn't. I mean, if you're intervening, you've changed the methods, and you're still getting rockfalls, this suggests that your intervention is not working. Now, there's a bigger story here, not necessarily at the level where Larry Knight was killed, but the mine was over-reliant on 2.3 metre friction bolts, split sets as they're sometimes called. A independent expert called Glenn Sharrock, who was going to become a university lecturer at UNSW's Mining Engineering School. We have a big mining engineering school. In fact, UNSW has big engineering faculties across. He had qualified, got his PhD, and then what he was doing was spending a year or two as a consultant, so he had some practical work experience. And he's a smart guy, and he was doing exactly what it was, because I'm teaching risk assessment. It's much better if I can talk about specific incidents that I know directly about when I'm trying to teach students, and the students like that, and they should like that. So you can have the theory, but in health and safety or risk assessment or risk teaching organisational risks, having some practical experience is really valuable. But Glenn was in there doing a technical job, and there's 2 points to take from this. I asked the consultants that went into the mine, did you speak to the workers as part of your activities? And Glenn said, normally, depends what I'm doing. If it's a very technical task, I may not. But normally I will go and talk to people at the face to get some information, because they're always going to know things that no one else knows. He saw a fall of ground while he was doing his inspection. It wasn't part of his task, but under the Universal Ethical Code of OHS professionals, which you all are, there is a universal requirement: spot a hazard, report a hazard. Doesn't matter why you're in, spot it. And I've been on site as a researcher, and I've had to do that. I've seen a hazard, I've had to report it, even though I'm there actually I was actually looking at inspectors. We used to joke. The inspector would go on site and say, don't worry, he's not looking at you, he's looking at me. That's what I'm doing. But I saw a hazard when the inspector's back was turned, and I basically had to report it. So he saw that, he inserted it in his report. They said, you weren't brought in for that reason? Sorry. I'm doing my job. And you know that good consultants have a caveat: I'm going to report everything I see, and if you don't follow all my advice, well, heaven help you. I used that in my report. They didn't like that. Said I was over-reporting. But they did subsequent analysis of the rock falls in the mine and found that the initial reporting of them found a very high proportion were reporting inadequate ground support as the reason for those falls of ground. I'm going to go into some of the backstory, what happened after. So the mine was put under a safety case regime, and look, that was I can talk about that. But the other thing was the misuse or the overuse and over-reliance on split sets was not just at the Beaconsfield mine. And so the Chief Mines Inspector, Andrew Tunstall, showed the industry the data and said, we need to move to better ground support. Some of the mines said, yep, we'll do that. Several did not. So the Chief Mines Inspector, Fred Sears, closed down intersections where he regarded there was inadequate support, right next to where production was occurring. Did this focus the mind? It did. And they were able to go back again, reporting to the industry on a monthly basis, which is great, the interchange between the industry and the inspectorate. And they reported back, and they were able to show them that after that intervention, where they were using more robust ground support in those particular high stress areas, that the number of unplanned falls of ground across the industry had dropped off. So they had been learning from failure. That's what happened after. But there was no risk assessment, or not an adequate risk assessment, and that was the major criticism of the coronial inquest. I was one of three experts, as I said, or one of two experts. Scott Marisette was the other. Scott believed that there was evidence of increasing seismicity, so the seismic event was actually predictable too. And there was debate about that. So the system failure. They didn't ignore ground conditions in the mine. But these rockfalls are occurring and are looking at their monthly safety meetings, and it's all about behaviour-based safety, almost totally about behaviour-based safety. Huge resources being thrown at this. Now, behaviour has a role in safety, but poor engineering that doesn't keep the ground up, the roof up, is not going to, the best behaviour-based trained worker, if you walk into an area that's inadequately support, 50 tons of rock, or even a kilo of rock falls on your head and you're wearing a helmet, and you're in for a serious injury at least. So there was an overemphasis on behaviour-based safety. Auditing. They hadn't had a proper audit done. The Tasmanian, I'll get onto that in regulatory failure, but they had a guy come in from an insurance workers' comp body. He'd done an overview. There was some good info in that. The mines management said, we like these bits, we don't like those bits, we'll do the bits we like. Is that what you do with an audit report? No. They didn't like the bit on worker involvement, amongst other things. He said you've got no. So, was Voldemort present? Question mark. The mine was in administration, so it was under pressure. I looked at it. I couldn't find smoking guns. They're hard to find. They had a forensic accountant to go in. He looked. He couldn't find anything. So we said no. Did a study. They came to a slightly different conclusion. And the mine was reopened after the incident under a safety case regime. They moaned about that because they're only a small mine. They operated very effectively for 2.5 years after that, doing all the things they should have done before that. And then they even processed the tailings and that, and they're now trying to reopen the mine yet again because it's one of the richest gold mines in Tasmania. And gold's getting more valuable. So, regulatory failure, as in New Zealand, when they brought in, who's heard of the phrase post-Robins OHS laws? Yep. So this is the big reform of health and safety laws in the 70s and 80s, where they merge all the old construction, scaffolding and those acts into a single act. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, usually it's called Workplace Health and Safety Act under the new model, 2013 federally compatible model, which I was involved with. Some jurisdictions who had half a brain, West Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, said, we're keeping our mine-specific legislation. In New South Wales, they incorporated it so it was entirely compatible with the overarching OHS Act. Queensland retained two separate acts, but tried to make the Mine Safety Act more compatible with consistent with the broad part of I could talk about Robins legislation till the cows come home and its strength. There'll be a leading expert in Perth in February next year to tell you will be giving a talk to the Edith Cowan group, the new mine safety thing on that legislation. But anyway, there were some good things with it. There were some weaknesses with it. And in WA, you retained the separate legislation, but you've also tried to accommodate it and brought the mines inspectorate in, but they're still separately resourced. Because in my view, hazards in mining are specific and you need specific regulations. We don't throw out what we learned 200 years. But in Tasmania and New Zealand, they did. Some smart bureaucrat thought this looks neater and bloody more dangerous, but yeah, you go ahead. And I could never find who that person or group were and what their reasons were. So New Zealand have abolished their extractive industry advisory group post-Pike. So I was on the expert reference group that helped draw up the legislation after Pike River. Then I was the expert on the extractive industries advisory group, and they decided that's too expensive and they don't like a group having a direct line to the top of WorkSafe New Zealand. Some bureaucrats said it should go through the committee of WorkSafe, you know, why should mining have a separate advisory group? Well, maybe if you want to avoid disasters like Pike River and serious fatal events. And the Chief Mines Inspector of New Zealand was not happy, tried to fight against it, but unfortunately, I won't say what prevailed, but it was something. And it wasn't rational. Okay. But they have huge gaps in the legislation, massively under-resourced. The Chief Inspector, Fred Sears, who was good, was enmeshed entirely in a coronial inquest on the West Coast. They had very few engineering qualified inspectors. There might have been one other in their inspectorate. And that's why I did the 3 mine audits, to try and upgrade them after part of it. And also said to them, if you've got a mining industry, you've got to have good quality mine safety legislation or you won't have a mining industry. And there are jurisdictions who have now, like Nova Scotia in Canada, after the West Road disaster around 1992, got wonderful mine safety legislation. There's only one problem. There's no mining industry left in Nova Scotia. So it's another point about why regulation actually matters, because insurers would not cover a mine following that West Ray incident. Pathway 8. 3 of the 4 underground supervisors I interviewed, and they were the 3 most competent underground supervisors, said, we believe the mine's unsafe. Their most experienced miners, including their contractors, held similar views. One of the miners had been so concerned, he put gave a letter to the underground manager. And he was asked, did you get my letter? Yep, I got it. End of story. There was one classic thing in a cruising. Yous do the mining and leave the engineering up to us. That does not send a good message. And so Todd had actually been talking to his wife and father about leaving the mine after the October 5 fall in Xmas. One of the underground supervisors took 5 or 6 weeks leave immediately after the October 2005, which is sort of, and we interviewed him, and that we know why he took the leave. So there were considerable concerns, not just by the mine workers, but the underground supervisors. And as I'm already indicating, that message was not getting back. It was not allowed to get back. It was being blocked. Now, they had a safety committee, and it sat, and it raised, after the first couple of meetings, they raised some serious issues, and nothing was done about them. If you want to kill a safety committee, that's how you do it. The first time people raise serious issues, ignore it. And then you've got a pencils and paperwork committee from that point on. They had no safety reps. There was considerable mistrust because the management had been actively anti-union at the mine. And there were no safety reps. The rescue was fabulous. The miners could actually get to them, and did. This is, again, not widely known. A number of them went in and spoke to Todd and Brant while they were trapped, but they were warned off because it was too dangerous. When I went down to have a look after, there was a completely buried bogger and a wall about, like on that angle, about to give way at any moment. And so we weren't allowed more than 100 metres from where the incident occurred. I've heard more about the rescue since, and I'm not going to steal anybody else's thunder about that, but I did know. It wasn't part of our thing, but they brought a team through to do a really wonderful, dangerous tunnelling work to get the guys out. And by the way, the guys were quite psychologically harmed, and also, even though they went to the pub after, were not in really good physical shape, and neither of them worked down the mining industry again, as far as I know. Cadia East Orange is another inundation event. This is a high potential incident. No one actually died here, but 7 easily could have. They failed to implement a barrier to prevent water entering a shaft that they were drilling. They failed to drill telltale holes to monitor. There was a lack of engineering rigour in the monitoring. And the reconciliation between material removed didn't take account of that wet material weighs more. Pathway Sec 2 was there. Again, you can find these actually in Heather's article. Pathway 3 was there. There were failures in risk assessment. There's a lot of data. You'll get this. I could talk about it, but there's a lot of data. And against the reliance on JSAs rather than safe work procedures in critical tasks where it's known and you can develop a safe work procedure. Pathway 5 was there. There was a verbal report that material had blocked the shaft. The supervisor informed the mine management of the blocked shaft by telephone. After discussions, management instructed the supervisor to bog up to the brow rather than carry out an engineering assessment. And 4, 6, 7, 9 and 10 were there. In other words, this was a high potential incident where all 10 pathways were actually present. So it's just serendipity, in fact, that there weren't people killed. And these are the other ones we need to know about. These are what high potential instances are, but it should never have got anywhere near that. This is not rocket science stuff. This is not some really complicated technological or organisationally technological failure. I don't know if you know the work of not James Reason, but Perrow, who writes about accidents and says in highly technological settings they're going to be inevitable. Rubbish. We can do that. And the incidents occurring even in the nuclear industry, which he looked at, weren't due to high technological complexity. They were due to the basic same sort of organisational stuff-ups that have caused incidents in other workplaces. They ran that argument with the North Sea oil industry too, and it was similarly a rubbish argument. Pike River. How not to manage a coal mine. So, Pike River, 2 really basic flaws, or 3. They had an early geological report, geotechnical report, which suggested that mining in the region was going to be quite problematic, which they ignored. They claimed the area, the west coast of New Zealand, that area is noted for its for gassy coal, methane and all coal, of course, but this is a particularly difficult area. They claimed that they were mining in a not very gassy part of a very gassy area. Yeah, you're laughing because yes, that is where alarm bells should go out. One is risking Trumpian logic at this point. Then they put their main ventilation fan underground. That's failure of design and engineering 101, because the first thing that goes out in any methane explosion then underground is to knock out your main fan so you can't reventilate the mine, you can't pump nitrogen in to stabilise it to conduct any sort of recovery or rescue operation. You don't locate your main ventilation fan even directly in line with the mine entrance, which they were doing at Cornwall Colliery, until one of the equivalent of your workman inspectors from New South Wales, probably Steve Barrett, his industry safety rep in coal mining, went in and said, no, put it off to the side. Because this was an explosion, it's going to get taken out. There are repeated exceedances of Methane at the mine, at the dangerous level. We know the dangerous level. We do not need to risk assess it. We know. So what was happening? It was interrupting production all the time. Can anybody guess what was happening? There are trip meters on mining equipment in coal mines that are designed to react to methane levels beyond a certain point. Disconnect the trip meter. Second one, safety concern. This is just one. I'm only, as I said, along these pathways you have multiple failures, particularly in this one. It's almost a horror film, this one. So it's a small place, New Zealand, and a lot of the people I sat on the expert reference group with in the extractive industry, great guys from industry, very committed to safety. But a number of them had a connection with Pike River, and somebody who did have a connection with Pike River went to the board and said, there are serious safety issues at this mine and we recommend you get an audit done. So what happened? Zero. That would come under your Voldemort pathway, wouldn't it? Where you've got a senior officer who's they're not really taking their responsibility seriously. Number 3, they weren't assessing the methane levels in the mine and talked with a view to better managing it. Their management system was riddled with errors, and look, the reports I given the board look good, but it was a bit like Camelot. Little models of Camelot were arriving regularly, or little reports on models of Camelot were arriving regularly. Too many contractors, too many inexperienced workers. Young kid, 18, asked his dad, who was a safety manager, to start at the mine a day early. The fatal day. Shouldn't even have been there. That's the other type of serendipity for badness. And that manager had to live with the death of his one worker and I think a severe injury to another one of them. I moved one that escaped. There were only 2 that escaped. They were right close to the shaft at entrance when it went off. There'd been no effective audit done of the mine safety system. I've already, now the Voldemort one, the mine was in financial trouble, never got close to its production targets, and then they had the bonus system from hell. If you wanted to mine disaster, this is the bonus system to implement. Give them a production target that the mines never got close to. Tell them that if they don't get there, they'll get a certain payment by September, and every week after that it'll decline. And did that encourage risk-taking at the mine? You better believe it did. So that helps explain why they were removing disabling the trip meters. I've already explained, like Tasmania, they'd abolished most of their mine safety laws, and they didn't think, and then they had to go in and implement it all. They did learn. They now have world's best practice legislation because it's modelled on the best place, which is here. And I'm talking about New South Wales, Queensland and WA in that regard. Concerns have been expressed prior. The hydro managed mining consultant, which is a lead expert from Japan, he left the mine because he didn't like what was going on or the safety of the mine. Now, one of your key consultants decides that he might be in a better place. And that goes back to Beaconsfield. The key consultant there, 2 revealing bits. One, when we asked him, did he speak to the workers? He's the one on for years. He said, no, I'll get all the information from management that I need. 2, an email for him immediately after the event indicated he wasn't entirely surprised. Pathway 9. An underground supervisor withdrew a team from the mine, there's a universal law. It's been in 100 years in mining legislation, and it should be a principle in underground mining. If you're uncomfortable, you should have a right to withdraw. And that was well known at Beaconsfield too. But when the underground supervisor led the group out, he rang up the union and said, "Is this okay?" The union said, "Absolutely." And then the HR manager rang up the union and threatened to sue them. Does that send a good message? He was the underground supervisor was one of those killed in the fatal explosion. I don't know about how many of the team were, but I know he was. And then we get the rescue. There was the only second egress from the... Now, we've known since the Hartley disaster of about 1867, when a winder got trapped, crashed into a mine, blocked it off, and a very large number of miners, I think hundreds, died. Since then, we've known you need a second egress out of a mine. That's also a factor in the worst metalliferous mine disaster in Australian history. Do people know where that is? Mount Lyell, 1912. 42 miners died when they got trapped underground. It's one of the reasons that they got check inspectors down there. Anyway, so the only way out of the mine was a steep climb up a ventilation shaft ladder, narrow. I forget how long it was, at least 100 metres. I think it might have been longer. Could have been 300. A fit miner, under ideal conditions, could get up. You've had an explosion, you've got noise, and you've got people trying to get out. Completely ineffective. And also remember the point about a rescue chamber. So a Queensland rescue team got to the mine very quickly. We have one of the great things that the mining industry does have, both here and on the East Coast, has got great rescue teams. And a Queensland coal mine rescue team arrived very quickly, had a look at it, and were advised not to go underground. And that proved to be very good advice, because 2 hours later there was a more violent explosion. But also, even looking at the first explosion, I looked at it later on video and I thought, nah. And I turned to my friends who are, like ex-Chief Mines Inspector of Queensland, Gavin Taylor, who's now head of the Mine Managers Association. I said, "Gavin, what do you think?" "Nah." "What did you think at the time?" "Nah, nah, nah." And then they ran that rescue narrative. At Beaconsfield and at Pike River, the first organisation hired after the disaster was public relations companies to handle it. And they run a rescue narrative. Because when you're talking about rescue, you're not talking about what happened and why it shouldn't have happened in the first place. And we do the same with disasters, you see. In the bushfires, a whole lot of the media hype was about a koala that they thought they saved but actually had to be euthanised later. When you had the earthquakes in Turkey, they talked about an 8-year-old girl they got out, which is a wonderful story. But what about the 4,000 who got killed? Isn't that slightly the bigger story? The rescue narrative and public relations companies do after mine incidents and other fatalities and general things are designed to detract attention from that there's been a major failure leading to the fatalities in the first place. So, and the manager of that mine, who now runs a nursing home, aged care facility at Wollongong, was talking about rescue when all the experienced miners were telling the relatives of the families, don't expect the worst. And it's better to be honest. Expect the worst. Well, and the anger of the families to this day is partly over that false narrative, which I think the manager extended beyond what even the public relations company might have thought was advisable, and the fact that he was never prosecuted for the incident and no one was held accountable. If we look at Ravensworth, This is a slow drip of death. Okay, for every major incident like Pike River, you get a lot of far more of these. So these are two incidents at a Hunter Valley open cut mine. One where a reject door bin failed and crashed into the head of a truck operator, killing him. And the other one where, and this is the one we all know and you raised at the beginning, light heavy vehicle interactions on open cut mine sites. We've got to get better at this one. We really do. And this was a young woman, first year of her work on site, labour hire, and we don't know if the heavy vehicle operator was also labour hire. We could never find that out. It's not in the report. And there was an incident at night where a heavy vehicle hit a light vehicle, and we know that's not going to end well for the light vehicle operator. What were the pathway one? There were problems with the reject bin door. The traffic management plan had identified a number of design problems with the layout. It's hard to sometimes separate heavy and light vehicles, but they had problems with the design, intersection design, grades, crossfalls that contributed to water ponding, which at night and other factors contributed to light that would disorient people and mean they wouldn't have great vision. And with 24/7 operations, you've got to consider that. Were there warning signals? Again, the lawyers are saying this is only learned after the fact. No. 5 prior movements of the door, unplanned movements. And automated equipment is not meant to behave in certain ways, but we all know that occasionally it does. When they did remote mining in the 915 and 925 level at Beaconsfield, which was part of the solution, they were only allowed to remote mine it, they had little cuddies so that when the machine decided to come back at you, there was somewhere to go. And they do sometimes have a mind of their own, just as like when I hit the down button on the slides, sometimes nothing happens. Okay, and then when we look at the intersection incident, how many prior events were there? Well, there were 11 in the sort of 2.5 years prior to that collision. How many near misses do you need before you think we might be having a serious problem here? Did they do a risk assessment? Yes, they did. They identified problems due to communication and vision issues. There was some reference to the wet conditions, but not night. And error perception during to building lights and ponding. Yep, so they identified some of the risks, but let's come on to what they did about it. And look, I want to make a point here. This is not, I'm not talking about failure in the here to say about how bad these companies have been. You know, they're named here because you can probably identify them anyway, and these are coming out of official government inquiries. This is the learnings. I presented this in the Hunter Valley about 2 kilometres from where this mine is. So, and I talked about these incidents. It's the learnings we bring out of it. This is not an exercise in pointing figures at companies. It's about learning so we can get better at it. Okay, so what happened with regard to system? When you're doing automation and software design, it's often a good idea to get some really close interaction between your designers and your engineers and your operators, because that's a better learning process. So there was some critical information that should have been passed on to the software and the design engineer that weren't. Both drivers, as I point out in terms of the systems, were recent, and we're going to come back to that issue. Recent employees. That the heavy vehicle operator had only been just certified as competent to operate that vehicle. This was his first shift. At night after rain was probably not an ideal beginning, particularly given the other design issues. Auditing. They did the risk assessment, what they recommend in relation to the vehicle industry. More administrative controls, more behavioural controls. They did not deal with the design failures, the engineering failures. Now, this was one where Heather went and read, where do I get the economic pressures from? She got two sources. Read the government, federal government's mine industry economic update, quarterly update, which has lots of information about the industry, economic performance and that. And you read the annual reports. Because not in the health and safety section, but in the production and investment section, they'll talk about their targets. And they were saying that they were doing a significant upgrade in production at this mine. And that they actually, and this is not so common, they admitted that this would put significant challenges in terms of staffing, training, and work processes. So this is your pathway. When you're making a significant change to work processes at your mine, this is one where that has to come into it. And in this case, the company at least said they were, but clearly what they did wasn't adequate at the end of the day. They didn't go back and say, okay, what are the retraining? And what engineering controls do we need, additional engineering controls? What hazards do we need to identify and remove? Because we're going to be dealing with a larger workforce, more vehicles on site, and the more greater potential of interactions. Okay, does that? Yep. So, what's the corroborating evidence? Well, Tanya, and some of you have already been part of it. Due to Marcus Catani. Marcus, put your hand up. You can have a good idea, and it can lie dead for decades. Things don't automatically. Marcus, to his credit, helped get some. I wrote this book for the industry. I was hoping it would get taken up. New South Wales Inspectorate did use it for industry training, but it was really when Marcus took it up and it became part of the agenda here. And I've shout out also to, I hate that phrase shout out, but I'm going to use it anyway, to the WA Inspectorate for embracing this, and Edith Cowan. So she used both the incident analysis and workforce surveys to look at the 10 pathways. Then I went and had coffee with a PhD student at Newcastle University and Heather, who was an OT, then had spent times in the mining industry and in the inspectorate. And she was doing a thesis on mine safety. And I'm having coffee with her, and about a month later, I'm one of her supervisors. And arguably, I suppose, in terms of what she did, I was probably end up being her most important. I said, okay, she hasn't just tested 10 pathways, she also tested socio-technical systems. She had a good supervisor in Denmark, Pete Kynes, who was an expert in that area. So she looked at 2 models, but that she tested 10 pathways looking at 51 serious mine incidents, and guess what she found? Not inconsistent with mine. Every incident had some pathways. The absolute lowest was 2, and it was an outlier, like it was so far away from where most of the other ones were. And remember the bit about how good the investigation is. The better the investigation, the more likely the pathways are to be present. But 75% had 5 to 7 pathways. So 3/4 of them had on average 6. I think it was a bit higher than 6. And a significant minority had 8 to 10. So this is why it's so important, because these are the holes in the cheese. These are the ones that are causing the serious events. And as I said, they don't often ask questions like, were there concerns on site prior to the end? Other corroborating evidence from Jackson's study, breakdown of information flows between shifts. We've already talked about that. I asked you to give me a little response, and you indicate that can be a problem. But one of the really depressing ones is you identify engineering, design and maintenance failures as responsible for 94 to 95% of your fatal events. And where do you go? You go to behavioural controls and administrative controls. They're not dealing with the cause, they're low level, and bluntly, in most circumstances, they don't work. Only if you get all the engineering, you need buy-in too. If you go after the engineering higher order systems, you're more likely to get worker buy-in because they can see you really do care about it. And your rules are likely to make more sense. You're leaving too much to somebody to work safely in what is actually not a safe situation, or which can become a dangerous situation. So we need to really move beyond that. And production pressures, she also found, were one of the things because they could lead to changes in decision making. And I think that's me for a while. Thank you. Do you have any questions then?
We'll actually push the question back. So folks, we just wanted to pop the slide up again, just in case those of you who haven't got the QR code. We will be having Q&A after I've done my little bit here, time permitting. So if you just 30 seconds to quickly shoot that QR code. No cameras, good. Okay. So in my earlier session, I can see a couple of cameras up, sorry, I won't go yet. All good, all good, all good. Cool. Okay. So in my earlier session, I did say that I would actually update our recent fatality data. Again, with the caveats that I put out this morning. Some of these are really fresh, really new. You can see descriptions on the interweb, but can I just say it's not the role of the inspectorate to release data that is unconfirmed, and the data that I've got up there is just those that we know and that we're comfortable that the families of the fatally injured people have been notified and at least canvassed that it's okay for us to include their data. So what do we know from the last roadshow? So from 2019 until the middle of this year, there's been 9 fatal accidents in the industry. There's 3 other cases that are currently under analysis of that workplace versus natural causes. And we have had 1 case of a rail fatality that's happened on a mining lease. Now, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but such are the nuances with our legislation that does not count as a mining fatality. Nonetheless, when we were in Karratha, everybody knew about that particular case. What I can tell you is that 6 of those fatalities have occurred on surface operations and 3 have occurred in underground operations. And we did have a question in the earlier session about what's the ratio. Well, that ratio is consistent with the previous data. It appears that we get 2 surface fatalities for every underground fatality. But just as I did in the earlier data when I presented it to you, 160,000 workers in the industry, there's 10,000 workers underground as opposed to about 150 on the surface. So when you look at that ratio, there is some, cutting the data very coarsely here, somewhere between 7 and 8 times more likelihood per worker of a fatality in underground than there is in surface. Okay. And as I said, we had started the project of cutting the data. And this time we've sort of drilled in a little bit deeper in terms of district rather than regions where the fatalities have occurred. Now, just note these are 2013-14 to 22-23, with the other caveats of some of those other fatalities have not been included. And it's interesting, before when we sort of said that it was the North region that was actually experiencing the vast majority of fatalities, you'll notice none in the Kimberley. So there's actually a bias, obviously, towards the more iron ore related districts. there was a large number in the Goldfields Esperance, but you see how that sort of split between Goldfields Esperance, Wheatbelt, Midwest, and there's some funny things that happened in there, in that the boundaries between the West region, the team that I lead, and the East region, which is based in Kalgoorlie, they're pretty hard areas to get to. And the question I'm now asking ourselves, and I have no data again, it's very, very formative, this question, is it because we're not getting out there frequently enough to those areas around Southern Cross and perhaps up around Meeker and what have you? It's a question that we're actually, I did say that this data is going to help shape our strategy. Do we have to, as an inspectorate, spending more time in those difficult to get to areas? And you can see just when we bring things back to the fatalities per million hours metric, that only 2 fatalities, I say only with with the conditions attached, but that's by far and away the highest in terms of per million hours worked. And then we have to ask ourselves, if there's something else happening in that particular part of the world that might mean that workers there are more at risk. We have no answers at this stage other than the questions are valid and able to be posed. But what I did want to finish on, and Stuart, wherever you are in the room, here's your chance to take the photograph. Thanks for the conversation earlier. I hope that many of you have seen this before and that this isn't new information. But what that recent data just has confirmed is stuff that we've known since 2014 when this report was released. It's at least 10 years young, this data, okay? But sadly, these more recent fatalities just keep proving the fact that the statistics do not lie. And the harsh statistics are that nearly 50% of all the workplace fatalities that have happened in the state in the last 20 years happened when the fatally injured person was in their first 12 months on the site. Not that they are, this could be a 50-year veteran, but they're on their first 12 months on the site. And the second damning statistic is that nearly 2/3 of the fatalities were recorded have happened when the fatally injured person was being supervised by a supervisor who was in their first 2 years of being a supervisor. Okay. Less than 12 months on the site, less than 2 years of supervisor's experience. So let's just try and form that up for a moment. If you have a cohort of workers who are in their first 12 months on your site and they are being supervised by a supervisor with less than 2 years experience, does that not mark them out as a particularly vulnerable cohort? And take a moment and think about that. How many workers at your current operation fall into that category? And what are you doing about addressing the potential risk? Can I also add, if they are fitters, which were also overrepresented, it's almost as if that group of workers are carrying a target on their back. I say, we have been hammering this point to the industry since the 2017 roadshow. And if it's the first time you've heard it, my apologies, but we've been singing this loud and clear and frequently at every time we get a gathering like this. I'm going to add another curly one in here. Last month was the first time in the memory of many of us where the number of contractors in the industry exceeds the number of full-time employees. Question, how long do contractors stay on your site? Is it less than 12 months? Does that not then make them especially vulnerable in that first cohort I just spoke about? This is why we asked Michael, is contractor management the 11th pathway? And Michael will actually will drive that bus a little bit harder for us in the concluding commentary. How effective is your contractor management system? Certainly we've recognised that in the legislation, and there are now special provisions in terms of contractors being part of the management system, actually having to have their own management plans, etc., etc. But here's a question for you. I am sure that many in this room were engaged in the symposium on sexual assault, sexual harassment that occurred on the 1st of August. One of the damning things that came out of the parliamentary inquiry was the registered manager under the old laws is obliged to report these events of high consequence to us. But overwhelmingly, the reason we hadn't got any reports before the public inquiry started was because they were happening to contractor staff. And the contractors felt that they weren't obliged to report to the RM. So you've got two systems that are running alongside each other with no interaction. What happens? Bang! The public inquiry occurs and all of a sudden the deficiencies are seen. How are your contractor systems integrating with your systems? Remember again, you've got 6 months, folks, before we expect your safety management system to be fully operational and implemented. And that most importantly includes how you're interacting with your contractors. Okay. I'm going to leave that because Michael's got a special finish. Sorry, Mike, I'm building you up here, but in terms of the role of our role in managing contractors. Okay, so having got my special messages out about the more recent data, let's turn it over to you for a moment. Okay, so there's that QR code again. And this is where we're going to get you a little bit interactive, and we are going to now replicate the questionnaire that we put out in 17, 18 and 19, and we need you to interact with us here, okay? Now, first things first, I'm actually going to get you to use Slido. So if you can actually have your digital devices at the ready. And I'm just going to pop the question up. How many of the pathways that Michael has described for us here today do you think are present at your mining operation and are currently weaknesses? So you're going to actually answer somewhere between 1 and 10, right, on your digital device. So there's your prompt. Whoop. There's only one pathway because our mine safety management system is in great shape. Or up the other end, all of them are apparent and are weaknesses at my mining operation. Okay? Just bang them in. Need your sort of emotional response here, particularly after Michael's gone and elaborated on how they manifest themselves.
Can you just go back to that last list, please?
The last what, sorry?
Last slide.
You want the QR code? Oh, the 10 of them? Okay, cheers, yep. Have I just gone and touched something here, Pavati? Bit of my hand draped across it. Okay. So, and again, you can follow this on your digital device as well. We've got nearly 70 people. 30% of you are saying all 10. Danger, 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 right? None of you have said 1 or 2. 25% of you are saying 7. So, instantly, what are we saying here? So, the power of the conversation that Michael is having with mine workers across the state is to start thinking about this, right? This is the start of the conversation. I've got 85 of you who have responded. That's terrific, folks. Thank you. Our average score, as you can see, is 7.3. That's a lot of pathways that we're going to have to deal with, right? And it's why, again, I reiterate the message that all of them are important, but pathways 1, 4, 5 and 9, right, are the ones that leap off the page to us. So if you're going to start somewhere, you start addressing those 4. Okay. So I'm going to draw a line under the poll for the time being. And now I want to take you onto the questionnaire. So you've got your digital devices in front of you. Now, the next 10 questions are all based around exactly the same thing. We'll be asking you to rank between 1 and 10 against the question I'm going to pose. Now, this questioning technique was taught to me by Professor Scott Geller of behavioural-based safety fame. Don't get Michael on that. But essentially, it's the key to it is me machine gunning the questions to you. And you giving me your emotional response, not your considered response. So you need to answer really quickly, and it's intuitive, right? It's driven from your tummy, not from your left brain. Okay? But I will take the first question steadily so you know what it is I'm pitching at here. So let's jump over this one. So here we go. Now, as we go through this, I will put that list of 10 questions, 10 pathways up at the end. But try and think of which of the 10 pathways you actually rated the lowest in this exercise. Okay? Which of the ones you think is the biggest flaw. So let's go. This is, you ready? Digital devices at the ready, fingertips at the ready. Here's your first question. It's about engineering, design and maintenance flaws. We're focusing on maintenance, and it's your impression, right? It's how you feel, not about how you think your operation and your co-workers feel. So, what do you think of maintenance activities on your site? A score of 1 is not planned at all. A score of 5 is some planning but mostly reactive. A score of 10, really well planned and delivered to the plan. So where on that 10-point scale do you think your operations fit? Hey, we've got a learned audience here. You're already screaming at that. Well done. Fabulous. So we're at 89 responses, which is 90. Terrific, folks. I'll give you just a few more seconds. Okay, so you can all see on your devices what the responses were, or can you? No, I don't think you can on this one, yep. All right, so give you some feedback here. 4, 5 and 6 all scored the same at about 17%. Number 7 at 23%. So we're sort of hovering around the some planning but mostly reactive type thing, right? Which is another meh result. Only 2 folks actually scored themselves at a 10, and 4 folks scored themselves at a 9. The rest of you were lower than that. Well done. So you've now got the hang of this, right? So I'm now going to speed up the questions, okay? Let's do it together. Here we go. So pathway number 2, failure to heed warning signs. How often do you think that warning signs are followed on your site? An answer of 1 is never. An answer of 5 is most of the time, but not by everyone. An answer of 10, all the time by everyone. And let's see how many 10s come in. Wowee. You guys are getting good at this. Fabulous. Excellent. 94 responses, and we did get 1 brave person who said 10. Okay, let's keep going. By the way, this is all anonymous data. The data will be sent across to Marcus's team, and they will crunch this for us for Michael to reflect upon in the September event. Pathway number 3. Do you know why risk assessments are done, what your role in them is, and how to do them? Right down the bottom, no, I'm not involved and have not been trained. A 5, I do them, but I don't know why. Or number 10, I know why and how to do them really well as per my training. Wow. I'm loving it. You're getting it in so quick. It makes the data just that much more valid. It's 90. Okay, we'll draw a line under that one. Interestingly, there's a cluster in 8, 9 and 10, which means that our risk management training and rollout is working well. That is encouraging from our perspective because, of course, understanding of risk is a fundamental part of the WHS legislation, right? Cool. Pathway 4. What do you know about the WHS management system on your site? 1, nothing, and I don't need to know. 5, I use some of the system as needed. 10, I know all the system elements and know how to use them. And a reminder, these are exactly the same questions we rolled out in 17, 18 and 19. Interesting. And remember, try and remember the one that you scored lowest as we're going along. Very good. So we've got a cluster of about 50% greater than 8. So I'm thinking there must be a lot of you in the audience are actually owners of management systems, right? Yep, exactly. But then there's 25% of you that are less than 5. So perhaps, I guess there's a communication opportunity there. Okay, pathway number 5, flaws in system auditing. Do you know if your WHS management system has been audited? Answer 1 is no. 5 is yes, but I don't know the details. 10, yes, and I know all the outcomes and actions that had to be implemented. Getting close. Okay. How's this for a surprise for some of you? Nearly a quarter of you have said 1. And remember, it was the weakest flaw from the previous roadshow surveys. Okay, let's move on to pathway number 6, which of course is the Voldemort pathway. Do you think that production is prioritised before safety on your site? A 1 is yes, and we get paid bonuses to encourage us to take shortcuts. A 5 here is I would be worried about stopping production for a safety issue. Or 10, never. I can stop production due to a safety issue and would feel supported if I did. Wow. Now, questions like that just re-emphasises why it's important to get your emotive response, because you can really overthink that, right? Okay, so in this case, a good 2/3 of you have voted 8 and above. How's that for an insight into culture across the sector? Pathway 7. Now, and be harsh, okay? We can take it. We're big folks here, Pete and I, and the rest of our colleagues. Do you think the inspectorate visits your site often enough and have the desired impact? So a 1 is no, I have never seen an inspector on our site. 5, I'm not sure. I've seen inspectors but don't know about their impact. 10, yes, inspectors are highly valued for their impact. Now, we haven't had a 10 yet. For those 3 people that have voted 10, thank you so much. That's right. And it's gone up to 4 on the back of my comment. Okay. Nearly 60% of you have actually ranked us 5 and below. We've got a bit of work to do, I think, gang. Okay, pathway number 8. If you raise a WHS issue, does it get appropriately addressed and feedback given? 1, never, and no feedback is given. 5, sometimes feedback usually lacks detail. 10, always. Feedback is timely and constructive. Thanks, Parvati. Boom. Keep them coming in. Super. Okay, so the majority of the responses are sitting between 7 and 8. And again, let's remember that that is an extension of the duty of care. If a worker raises a hazard, then it's incumbent upon management to actually feed back to them what's been done with that hazard and how the controls have been implemented. So that's pleasing to see. Pathway number 9. Describe the level of worker management, communication and trust on your site. A 1 is non-existent, a 5 is meh, and a 10 is excellent and couldn't be better. And again, this is an emotional response, right? Wow. I really can't draw any conclusions out of that. It's there's about 40% of you that are less than 5, and then there's a cluster of you that are saying 7 and 8. So some splitting around the room. And let's finish on pathway number 10, emergency response, right? So if an emergency happened on your site, what would the response be? 1, terrible, we're completely unprepared and under-resourced. 5 is fair, we might get by. And a 10 is excellent, we're well prepared and the emergency response team is well trained. That's not the Royal Flying Doctor Service, this is how your critical responders get to the scene. Nearly there. We're just closing it up. So 65% of you have voted 7 and above. And again, we put a lot of energy and effort into emergency response, right? We've got the emergency response competitions, etc. So it's not a surprising result and pretty consistent with what we've seen so far. Okay, so the next thing, try and remember what it was, which pathway was the lowest score. What we'd like you to do now is to talk to the people around your table. What was the lowest scoring pathway and why? And I'm just going to flip the pathways back up again. Just, 2 minutes, just 2 minutes. Folks, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut the conversation there. But did you listen to yourselves? The buzz around the room was just fabulous. All right. And here's the thing about that questioning technique. The 10 questions aside, this has now actually become the cornerstone of a conversation, right? And we're not sort of talking about esoteric stuff. We're actually focused on the 10 pathways, and we're actually trying to get perceptions out onto the table. It's a really, really important mechanism here, right? Just, can I now, on your digital device, can you just tell us which pathway you voted the lowest? Great, some of you have already taken up the cudgels, which is great. But that level of conversation was just music to my ears. Just give you another minute or so to pop that in. Just need another 10 responses or so. Can you all see how that's unfolding? Parvati? The group can see the outcome? Yeah, cool. So we've got 76 of you, and Flaws in System Auditing, unsurprisingly, is the leader. So Pathway 1, Pathway 4. Now, I'm not sure whether that's because we've actually emphasised that was the weaknesses in the past, but I hope it wasn't. But what it does say to us is that nothing's changed from 2019. Which means I guess we've got to improve our messaging. And certainly if that failures in system auditing keeps like that, I reckon that there's probably a guidance note needed. Yeah. Okay, so now can I just move on to the next little question, which is another word cloud thing. Can you just, a recurring theme that might have happened around your table as to why those scores were so low for those particular things? Can you just give us a couple of words on what we would say were recurrent themes in your conversation? And the question says, is there a recurring theme? Yes and no is not the answer I'm after. It is, what were they, please?
How do you spell man?
Yeah. Yeah, somebody said yes. You can change your yes and no's to something a little bit more meaningful. And I take it you can see the word cloud unfolding on your device? Wow. Communication, lack of communication, production over safety, there's... Wowee. So again, here we've got this challenge. How do we get better at at reducing our fatal risk profile? We really believe that Michael's teachings have got some of the answers, not all of them, but some of the answers, and we've started the conversation off. Now, what we've done is we are indebted here to Edith Cowan University because following on the back of Tanya's research, Dr. Katani has actually put together a version of that questionnaire for use by industry so that you can replicate what I've done here with this quick and dirty machine gun approach, but the end result being we need to start the conversation, but you can actually use that questionnaire with your own work groups or across your organisation. Marcus, stand up. You've only had your hand up before. There he is. If you want to see him, now this will actually take you, this QR code will take you directly to that, that questionnaire for your use. If you want to do some organisational work, Marcus can actually customise it so that you can actually have your organisation or work group identified so that you can collate all the data together. Sorry? Oh, okay, sorry, not that QR code. What happened to it? Did I go over one? That one? Have I taken it out? No. You sure? There it is. There it is. Whew. That was not a failure in auditing. Okay. It was a failure in my risk assessment. So again, thank you to Marcus and the team. When you open up the survey, it's got Marcus's contact details at the bottom of it. You can contact you directly, Marcus, yep, if you want to do an operational structured approach. And again, that QR code will be part of the package that we put together post the roadshow. All good? All right, so I'll go back to where I should have been, which is here. So hopefully you'll be able to use that survey for your own purposes and get the conversation sort of bedded down even further into your organisation. Here he is for the big finish. Let's welcome him back. Come on, Michael.
Thanks very much, and particularly thank you for being so engaged today. This is a process. I really think we can take the industry forward if we keep involved with it, and your feedback has been really great and the way you've listened today. So, and I've learnt things through these roadshows, but let's conclude by looking at when I mentioned that rescue and healthcare can save people's lives. In May 2020, there was a methane explosion at the Grosvenor mine, Anglo mine in Moranbah, and 5 miners were severely burned. There was actually 2 small explosions near the longwalling machine, and as you can see, I'm not going to go through it. Most of the pathways were there. The point of ignition is still a subject dispute. This is not unusual in coal mines. In fact, in a number of Queensland disasters, the mines like Pike River have had to be sealed, so they'll probably never know what caused the initial explosion. The basic issue, of course, is there should have been adequate methane drainage. That's the only point I'll turn to, the Voldemort. The Board of Inquiry found that management had knowingly allowed production to exceed their capacity to drain methane from the mine. So that was a pretty damning finding. But I want to turn, and the second point I make is it was all a labour hire workforce. On the contractor issue, I'm coming across to speak. There's a new professor being appointed in mine health and safety, a unit at Edith Cowan. They will have keynote address as part of that new unit. I'm coming across in February to speak. It'll be well advertised, and I'll be talking about contractor management and the 10 pathways at that particular one. There'll be also an international expert on worker involvement, health and safety reps. He'll be giving a talk there. But the whole workforce was labour hire. Since that incident, there are no labour. It's now entirely direct employees. In fact, one of the outcomes of the labour shortages in the Queensland mining industry is that mine workers have been rejecting contractor appointments in favour of being direct employees. And given the situation, it's a change that has to be accepted because they're short. I mean, as I left Rockhampton Airport, there was a mines union organiser who'd been rung up by a group of guys going onto a mine site. They had demanded to be direct employees, and they wanted him at the airport when he landed to sign them up as union members and direct employees. So, look, I will talk about the results and evidence obviously in February, but generally contractors is a serious health and safety issue, not just in mining, but in all industries. And I actually did a chapter for a book on it as a result of an explosion in a factory in France. They did a special meeting on contracting and safety in other industry, and I was asked to write a chapter for that. I was supposed to go to Paris, but COVID intervened. But so one point I will make here: contracting is the 11th pathway. When in 2001 the EZF factory blew up, we had heavy use of subcontractors, and people were killed. The person that when it went through a series of stages, Total was the company owning the lot. It went to this final point of prosecution, and they brought in an expert called Annie Tibamoni, who's a colleague of mine, and she wrote a report based on 10 pathways and that incident, and a conviction at the final appeal stage was here basically to her report. And she asked me why I wasn't going to make a contract in the 11th pathway. And I've thought long and heavily about this. And my current thinking is it remains in management systems, because when you're managing your system, contractors have got to be part of it. They're also part of change. And there's labour hire and other groups that are under that rubric. So, and also contractors can affect other pathways, your reporting systems and things like that. So that's why I've left it there. I want to make one other point. Has anybody heard of high reliability organisations? Now, there is an argument in Queensland that is the basis of their reset, and I'm going to give you my very blunt view. It's entirely inappropriate for the mining industry. The notion of high reliability organisations came out of the nuclear industry, which are marked by stable organisation, stable technology, stable workforce, stable market. Is that the mining industry? And that's the answer to your question. I've said that. Nancy Leveson, who's an international mining safety expert in the US, has said that. Andrew Hopkins has said that. So their safety reset, in my view, is doomed to failure. 10 pathways. I know it's my model, but I don't care if I was entirely forgotten. It's the importance of the model. We need to focus. If we focus on failure, we will deliver benefits to the industry in the longer term. And there are people on the East Coast that are smart enough to realise that's a better approach. But in a way, WA may help drive them and convince the East Coast that it needs to catch up. The final thing is about the rescue. At that day, two things happened that were critical and serendipitous. One of the miners was not as close to the methane explosion as the others, was able to go outside and raise the alarm. 2, there was a pandemic. And just that day, in a remote Queensland town, there was an anaesthetist visiting Moranbah to do COVID training. Now, the more I learn about anaesthetists, they're not just people that pump gas into you. It's a really specialised operation. For your information, the first successful operation with anaesthesia in Australia was conducted in Launceston in 1847, about 200 metres from where I live. And there's a statue of him in the park. And the other thing was, he was really smart. He used ether, realised how bloody dangerous the exercise was, and never tried again. So she was there. She stabilised the guys so they could get them to a burns unit. But for her presence, but for the guy getting out to raise the alarm, there would have almost certainly been multiple fatalities in that event. And you wouldn't have been looking at a high potential incident. You would have been looking at Queensland's latest mine disaster. So again, we need to be aware of how close we're running to significant incidents, and that serendipity, we can be grateful for it. We should not rely on it. That is Wayne Sellers. He was one of the miners that was severely injured. If you look close, you can see how his ears have been severely burned. That is the better side. So those of his family's going in to give evidence. He's the only labour hire worker that was prepared to give evidence to the inquiry. The others were too afraid that they, rightly or wrongly, that they would have trouble getting work in the mine or at other mines. It's become a non-issue because that mine now has a totally direct workforce. And that affects your reporting back. Now, one of the issues with contractors and labour hire, why do they undermine safety? One, are they in a hurry to get a job done? Two, they tend to have more inexperienced people or people not familiar with the site. Three, because they're in a hurry to get a job done, they're more likely to cut corners. Four, there's more likely to be disorganisation of communication flows on site. The more chains of command you have on site, the more potential you have for miscommunication, practices going on that should have not been allowed to go on. And finally, it's a much greater, more challenging situation for the regulator. Now, that's true for the mining industry and it's true for other industries. When Annie wrote her book, she wasn't out of the chemical industry, wrote a book on nuclear power generation in France and irradiation, a subject dear to Martin's heart, and they used subcontractors in the nuclear industry, and guess who got the overwhelming dosages of radiation in the nuclear industry in France? The contractors. So that's why she's an expert on contracting. So this is another point about why feedback loops, why getting people to talk freely back. The results of the survey weren't bad on that, but we need those loops and we need to value our health and safety reps. They're really critical to getting that feedback and making sure our mines are safe and robust. So, and often, when you've got a health and safety rep, the contractors will report problems to them because they don't want to speak directly, but they know they can filter problems back. Okay, so what are the lessons for prevention out of this? Well, identifying those 10 pathways, we now have an explanation of why we get recurring fatal incidents in mines. And we can use that as an auditing tool, as an investigative tool, and as assessment checklist or tool, and not a tick the flick risk assessment I used to teach. We all like numbers, but good risk assessment recognises you can't put a number onto everything. You need to do a qualitative element to your risk assessment. And one of the positive things that came out of the Bunbury session is one of the companies is already working on development a self-assessment tool based around 10 pathways. The Mines Inspectorate is looking at that. I don't know if Peter's around. Yeah, they are. They're up the back. They've got nooses on their neck now. And this is a really good conversation we can have between the industry and the inspectorate and me to get a really good assessment tool so that we can assess our performance in a more effective way than is occurring now, though the feedback today has been very useful. It is obviously critical to audit your principal hazards and other management plans to detect any and correct corrosion and detect with an eye to identifying failure, not just to confirm that the system is working. This will, in my view, and I've been in the area in health and safety now for 4 decades, but in my view, this, not just in mining, but in other industries, but mining, I think, is ahead of the game on this one, that we can make systems that are more robust, assist the inspectorate to focus on higher order failures and move the debate on, and to make better use of its resources. I mean, I think we need a debate here to get more resources into the inspectorate anyway, but if we get good systems, then the role of the inspectorate changes a little bit more and is not just in hazard identification. And your HSRs will be a critical resource in that. And as I said earlier, when you're redesigning your work, using your knowledge of your workers at the face, your supervisors, your engineers, and you will come up with better solutions. Now, systems are hierarchies of control. They're very good at, if they work, at filtering information down. They're not very good at taking feedback. And so I mentioned those 8 incidents in Queensland where they went that close to a serious fatal event, and it was pulled back at the last system. So one of the other awarenesses here with the failures is that you've got a good system and you are implementing it, very crucial, you are aware that they can corrode over time, changes of personnel, people getting a bit focused on other things, etc. And I've talked about the importance of feedback loops in that, and independence and taking criticism and constructive dissent, and not the constructive criticism. You remember the Blues Brothers were in the parking lot and he's criticising his driving and he says, "Can't I have some constructive criticism?" Anyway, maybe that's... So the next one is that 10 pathways applies to both single and multiple fatalities. So we don't need that debate anymore. And a more important debate is, we're learning still, is if we focus and put a lot of attention in these, we're probably going to end up with systems that are robust more overall. And you could, as I've already been mentioned, you can use this in the health area as well and the psychosocial area. Patent causes are latent failures. So any one of these failures can cause a fatality. But the more you have, the more likely you are to get a fatal event. And the more failures you have under a single pathway, the more likely you are to get a fatal event. But this is the point we intervene. We don't want Peter's fromage mahal of endless layers of new cheese. I mean, exciting for those who are fascinated by eating television shows on YouTube shows on eating, which I am. I love there's one called Beard Meets Food, which I love. But I don't want to do it. And look, we need to plug the holes rather than another layer of cheese. And that's a learning that's actually come really out of this exercise. And there's been a great interaction, and I hope this will continue, because this is not going to happen overnight. Any change in a work system, downsizing, expansion, use of contractors, agency work can weaken your OHSM, so that your management system. So we need to recognise that. Safety culture, I looked at it because it was not a pattern failure. What it was, at best, is a symptom. And that was the example I gave you where Heather did the focus groups at the mine site and found that the views of the supervisors and the mine workers were quite different to those at the management level. So those sorts of things, you can detect that, and it's a problem. Effective high potential incident investigation and auditing is critical. Beaconsfield, they collect this rockfall data, but they never analysed it in terms of trends. And of course, high potential incidents, it can be a trend, or it can be a single incident. You can get a single high potential incident and that alone gives you a warning that something is seriously wrong. And as I've shown, you can use 10 pathways to analyse your high potential incidents. And the other thing is that ruling some out is just as much a learning exercise as ruling some in. But if you don't ask the questions, you'll never know. I've already talked about the importance of dialogue, constructive criticism and feedback, so I'm not going to bash that anymore. We need to problem solve. This is what our bread and butter is in safety. We're solving problems, really, aren't we? And focus on upstream solutions. If we can get design and engineering systems improvements, we can stop the problems at source. And there's some really great examples. I've talked to companies, including big mining companies, about some really exciting ways where they've gone in with a safety-driven, engineered out the problem, and they've had a productivity boost as well. But it hasn't come through and going after productivity. It's gone because they've gone in with the safety. So they've actually ended up with a more effective safety solution, and it's actually improved the performance of the organisation. And that's the sort of goal we need to work towards. And focusing on fatalities and high potential incidents is really a point to get the learning. We don't want the fatalities, but we should learn from them. I think I've given that one a ride. Periodically, we need to sit back and ask big questions. Again, this is a benefit of something like this. Every year we get to sit back, but I used to periodically ask as an academic every 2 or 3 years whether I was a complete waste of space, whether I'd actually had any involvement in my teaching research that had made any benefits. And not liking the answer, I mean, that was a joke, it was me. Clearly Mike was having another judgment on that. But it is important to ask that, and every person should ask that individually, but organisations should ask that question. Are we doing this? Is there better ways? Are there big questions? Lean organisations never innovate because they're too busy. You need time to reflect, and so it's important on all grounds. We need, of course, to tap in, as I have, to the experience of miners, managers, safety reps, inspectors. I learn every day from talking to those people. And so on a mine site, it's exactly the same. You need to tap into all that experience. The big one, it's not Voldemort, but boards need to be made accountable to health and safety. They don't turn up. Is there anybody who's a director here? Tells you something, doesn't it? They have responsibilities under the Health and Safety Act, don't they, Peter? The inspectorate talks to them occasionally. Whenever the finances are going well, they're always responsible. And when things go wrong in safety, they seldom put their hand up. Too many bean counters, too many finance. And as I asked, how many OHS people sit on a board? And we need them. We need them to ask those questions because they make some critical decisions and they need to be able to demonstrate when they're saying to a mine, your production will increase 20% over the next 12 months. And we've looked into it and we know it can be done safely and this is how it's going to go. Because we've talked to the safety people and they've said this is the way we need to do it. Not give a directive to the manager and then let them work it out. Because I think I've already talked about ruling things in, ruling things out. There's a popular quote attributed to, rightly or wrongly, semi-wrongly I think, to Albert Einstein, that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a form of insanity. So what's really critical is that we need to learn from failure and change things. Because if we don't, we'll be in exactly the same space 12 months from now. So failure is a great teacher. And if you look at human society over years, there has been learnings. Maritime shipping is a lot safer since the Titanic. We did learn from failures there. So we do, but we shouldn't have to have a catastrophic event to learn. So that's a really critical takeout. And what are we learning from? We know the failure points now. We know what causes serious incidents, high potential incidents, fatalities, multiple fatalities in the mining industry. So we need to learn from those failures. And if we do learn from them, we'll become the exemplar jurisdiction where we'll be able to say, if you want to learn about how to run a mining industry profitably and safely, you go to WA. Okay, thank you very much.
Isn't he fabulous? Hey, it's been an absolute pleasure travelling around the state with Michael and Peter. I made a commitment to 2 people in Karratha that I would actually raise this on the next series of forums. One of these fellas asked me the question, Martin, if we've got so many contractors in industry now, and they're the vulnerable cohort, why the heck is it that the first 3 days all we do is soak them in a brand new permit to work system? And it's different from every site that they go to. And every 3 days, it's exactly the same waste of time, burning up of resources. He implored me to ask the audience here to start a movement to get what is known as, in the North Sea, an integrated safe system of work, so we can have a single permit to work system across the industry. Can I ask you to help empower and to live up to that commitment? It knocked our socks off, but how can you be struggling with fatal risk control protocols when in fact you've got a different or marginally tweaked system at every different site you go to? It was recognised as a problem in the North Sea. It was addressed, and now you've got this integrated safe system of work that applies across, that helps contractors in particular out. So we've spoken to one industry representative group yesterday morning, and there was some appetite for it. We're speaking this afternoon. I'll be putting the same thing to that group. But really, it's the groundswell from here that's got to change that. And I think it would be a huge step forward if we were able to tackle that. We've got some of our resources that have been built to help you out. First of all, our code of practice and mine safety management systems, the fromage to hull avoidance guidance, if you like, our emergency management code of practice and the audit have both been updated and are sitting there. We have several projects now to try and tackle some of our other guidelines as well to keep you posted. We've already spoken about the 10 Pathways survey, and say I commend that to everybody here, and to reach out to Marcus. And then finally, if I can, just a few thank yous. First of all, can I get a show of hands of the safety and health representatives in the room? Good on you, folks. Look, Michael's already passed comment on the important role that you play. From an inspectorate's perspective, we really value what you do. We know it's a tough job. We know it's a labour of love. Keep going hard. If you see inspectors on your site, ask to have a chat with us. Come in through our inquiry line if you need some assistance. You are an extremely important part of this improvement process that we're all on. And from the inspectorate to you, thank you so much for the job that you do. It's much appreciated. Secondly, to our little group of comms folks, great effort, everyone. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure working with you, and it's another great show. Thanks in no part to your contribution. So thank you very much for that. To all of you, we've taken you through Slido and twisting fingers and like that. Just love to see everybody as engaged as you have been. It's terrific that you could be here taking time out of your day. I really hope you've got something valuable out of the session. And on the back end of this is Michael's email address, and he's actually looking forward to personal contacts from people out of the room. So please avail yourselves of that opportunity. To my old mate, Pete Nissen, thank you, Pete. Good as always, super. But the major accolades go to the good Emeritus Professor Michael Quinlan. Please join me again in thanking him. I did say that we would give you the opportunity to keep in touch. Those of you who aren't receiving our email alert, that's it up on the top there, the dmers.wa.gov.au/subscribe. Get on to our emails. As I said, it is fabulous in terms of letting you know what's coming around the corner. I'll leave that slide and I'll finish, but there are two other slides that are replete with the references that we've cited today. And Michael's actually put together a page of 15 references that he actually used as part of his research as well. All the hyperlinks are there for you to go and find out further information, and importantly links to Heather's paper and to Tanya's paper as well. So, that's going to be perhaps another 2 weeks, perhaps 3 weeks by the time we finish packaging everything up. Don't forget, the video, once it's produced, will also be available on the website, and you'll be able to follow everything as well. I'm going to finish with one small fact. Very beginning of today, Michael said it's much safer being in mining than it is on the road. As you leave here today, you're entering into a higher risk area. All right, drive safely, and we'll see you at our next forum. Thank you, everyone.